Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. Warm welcome to this workshop on open research data, which is an event of the Berlin Science Week with many other events from today until the end of the week. Now, we want to discuss here open research data, and open research data are a central component of open science. We think, in particular as an academy, that it's important to discuss this from the viewpoint of different disciplines, sciences, humanities, economics, and so on. And we want to discuss not only the scientific aspects, but also the legal aspects, the organizational aspects, and last but not least, financial boundary conditions, which come into play when things must get or should get reality. Now, at the moment, there are many independent open data initiatives and different efforts from all kinds of players. And we think that because of that, it's very important to foster interdisciplinary discussion about science-adequate concepts and also methods. And another key point in our view is the role of the scientist who is generating the data. The role of the research organizations which run the research institution, the role of the funding organizations, and last but not least, also the public has its share in this endeavor. Now, I'm very pleased that we have a group of leading experts of the field. So we have a mixed program of talks and a panel discussion at the end. So thank you very much for coming and participating in this event. And before I start, I would also like to thank the Wilhelm and Else Heraeus Foundation for the generous support of this meeting, which could not happen without that. And finally, I'd like to thank Uwe Tintemann and Helen Sibbett for organizational support from the Akademie side. Now, that's all I wanted to say at the beginning, and so let's get started right away. So I'm pleased to announce Eric Schultes. Let me give a very brief introduction into his biography. Eric is an evolutionary biologist by training, and he is a leading fair data specialist. You will see this in his talk. Eric's early academic career focused on fundamental research in biophysics, in biochemistry and biology, and he worked on the origin of life and the emergence of structure and function in biomolecules. And as you may know, this is connected with huge data sets you have to treat, for example, from X-ray diffraction and so on. And so Eric has developed, maybe because of that, a strong interest in advanced data handling and data infrastructures. He is currently the FAIR implementation lead at the Go FAIR Foundation in Leiden and the scientific director at Partners in FAIR. And the title of his keynote talk is Open Science, Fair Science. Eric, please.
Great, thank you, Thomas. And I might add, I've been the last 5 years full-time at the Go FAIR Foundation, but hopefully in the next couple months I make a move back into academic research, and so I tend to look at my FAIR sabbatical now with pleasure and satisfaction. But I will maintain a part-time position anyways at the Go FAIR Foundation. First off, thank you, Thomas, for the introduction, and thank you and also the organizing committee for the opportunity to present to you today. It's very nice to be among such a distinguished panel of speakers here. Okay, so indeed, my presentation is labeled Open Science, Fair Science, and although I think open and fair, let me see, share many of the same aspirations, I would like to spend the main part of the talk today trying to make a distinction between open and fair. Just to say, FAIR is of course a well-known acronym by now. It's for data and services that are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, not only for people, but more and more for machines as well. So it's about automating FAINR in taking some of the heavy lifting of data science off the shoulders of people and putting it onto the machine. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Why don't we go, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, voila. Yeah, that's better. And so this is to say that I think the idea of open and fair are sharing many aspirations, but in fact there's a distinction here, and that's what I will try to focus on today. And I will do that in 3 steps. I'd like to maybe give a grounding in the FAIR principles themselves. There's sometimes some misconceptions about what FAIR is trying to get at, including a conflation often between open and fair. I want to say a few things about FAIR implementation, so actually implementing the FAIR principles. That's been my job at the Go Fair Foundation, and I've worked with a broad spectrum of stakeholders to try and show some implementations. But I'll show some cutting edge things that we're doing for implementation, and then lastly just kind of give a snapshot of if we had a world of fair data and services, then what kind of science would be possible? And how would that compare to the kind of science that we're doing today? So I'm going to start with a photograph that I took in 2019. The gentleman at the podium is a guy named George Strawn, and he was in 1995 the director of what was called the NSFNet. And this was an American project that tried to connect 100 universities to various supercomputing networks. And back then, this was an engineering challenge. If you have independent computer networks that were built up in different implementations, how do they connect? How do they interoperate? And what George is saying here in the slide is that by 2019, the internet was 50 years old, because the core technology of TCP/IP was invented in 1969 and was developed for about 20 years. Then there's about 10 years of development on the NSFNet itself, and that's when George stepped in. At some point, it was noticed that there were more private interests using that network than academic organizations. And then around 1995, that's when the NSFNet was translated from a government project, a government network, and handed over to the private sector, and that became the internet that we know today. In that year, 1995, the inventor of TCP/IP, a guy named Bob Kahn, wrote a paper that was, again, quite visionary. It's called A Framework for Distributed Digital Object Services. In what Bob Kahn and Robert Walensky were anticipating was a time when the volume of data and the complexity of data was so big, so much, that machines would have to start being able to handle some of the processing, because it was simply going to overwhelm human capacity to keep up with it. And so they were anticipating an infrastructure of services that were processing what they called digital objects. And it was really this very high-level abstraction of what needs to happen in a data context if you were to have machines more and more do fundamental, basic data munching operations. So then you fast forward to 2014. In the research environment of Leiden University, we ran a workshop at the Lorenz Center called Jointly Designing a Data Fairport. And this was a workshop attended by private sector, public sector, sort of broad spectrum of stakeholders, including George Strawn, by the way. And the play on words here, the Fairport, at this point of when the meeting was running, FAIR did not have the acronym of findable, accessible, et cetera. It was a play on words for airport, in the sense that we could imagine some kind of data infrastructure that's something like an airport. When you go to the airport, there's all these vendors, all these services, somehow harmonized, that get you comfortably from point A to point B. And could we do the same thing for data? So They were imagining or making a metaphor out of an airport for data. However, 2 years later, that acronym changed, or that play on word changed, and many of the participants at that workshop published this article, which is where the FAIR guiding principles were first published and the acronym first came to be. But the idea is here, and I'm quoting from the article itself. The article was really trying to get at this idea of machine actionability and essentially automating the F, A, I, and R functions. And I think it's pretty clear by now that the idea was wildly accepted across the board, internationally, different domains, different cross-sections of the information space. So apparently it was touching a need that was felt, but maybe not well expressed. It's been cited now to the point where it's I think, among the most highly cited papers. Box 2, there's a figure item in that paper. Box 2 was the enunciation of the FAIR principles themselves. It's these 15 one-liners for F and A and I and R. But there was no explanation given whatsoever. It was just a set of simple statements, behaviors that you might expect if you wanted a computer to do these functions. So let me say just a few words about the principles. If I had more time, we could actually go through each of them, and that's kind of fun to kind of parse them out and see how they were written and maybe how they're being realized today. But it's enough to say at this point, you see metadata everywhere. And if nothing else, I think the FAIR principles did a great job elevating the idea of metadata to be a first-class citizen with the data itself. But it's not just metadata, it's machine actionable metadata. So it's schemas that are somehow encoded for the machine. It's using controlled vocabularies that can be resolved, where terminologies can be resolved to the actual meaning of the words using globally unique persistent identifiers. So it's a particular kind of metadata. I also want to highlight Principle R 1.3, which is a call out to the domain relevant community standards. And what this really means is that although the FAIR principles are often, you can see, very technical, they also oblige the research scientists to participate. We need the domain relevant community standards. Other elements of the FAIR principles in the same color, meaning that these are also the decisions that need to be happening at the domain level, at the scientific level. But I'll make a distinction between those blue principles and what I call the red principles, which are really the information technology related, kind of infrastructure related principles that we might look to experts out there in the technical domain for answers. And generally speaking, if the red principles are indicating some kind of infrastructure, you might expect that those red principles would change less or more slowly than might the blue principles, where there's a lot of new ideas, new activities, new vocabularies that need to be encoded. So that's a snapshot of the FAIR principles, but it's also nice to show the counter examples what FAIR is not. FAIR is not a standard. These are very high-level principles to which many standards could be applied. And therein lies the real implementation game. How are we going to make decisions on the standards that we want to implement with? And is there a structured, coordinated way of doing that such that we can get widespread convergence? FAIR is not just semantics or semantic web or linked open data, it's additional elements on top of that. FAIR, and this point is maybe the heart and soul of my presentation today. FAIR is not the same as and should not be conflated with open or with free. There's lots of examples of data that are open and open access publications, for example, that may not be FAIR. They may not be using controlled vocabularies. They may not be using machine actionable metadata. So they are open data, but they're not necessarily machine actionable. On the contrary, some data can never be made open, but can just as well be made fair. And as a biologist or someone who works in a biomedical research domain, patient data is a great example of incredibly potent research information. You could do virtual clinical trials for a fraction of the cost if you could access patient data. But of course, you're never going to have just outright open public patient data available. And then lastly, oftentimes I will hear a request for additional principles. So we should add something about responsibility or trustworthiness or ethics. So maybe we have the fairer principles. But by design, the FAIR principles left out any explicit reference to data quality or trustworthiness, et cetera, because these they were felt to be very context dependent. So high quality data in one context is low quality data in another context. But it is implied that if you have rich machine actionable metadata, you can probably infer trustworthiness and data quality to a much better degree than you could otherwise. So it might be, maybe there's an argument to be made that fair data can actually get you to more trustworthy data or a sense of how reusable are the data, even though it's not built into the principles explicitly. And then so that's the FAIR principles. Just a couple words on implementation. The organization I've been working for, the Go Fair initiative, had as a mandate to translate the FAIR principles into implementations. And we did that with a broad spectrum of stakeholders. We have implementation networks, we call them, spanning all kinds of different domains and different interests. The Go Fair initiative, actually, it's maybe nice to mention, started as a project in 3 ministries, a German, Dutch, and French ministries. It was supposed to be a temporary project, kind of a kickstart to FAIR implementations, especially for EOSC, targeting EOSC as an example. And as intended, the Go Fair Foundation, or the Go Fair initiative, came to an end sometime last year, but the community that formed around it has decided to go on. And I think there are now 8 national level Go Fair offices in different countries. And the organization I'm working for is the Go Fair Foundation, which is a spin out of the initiative that's now a private foundation. We can do contracts and projects and things like that. And one of the projects we have just initiated is called Fair Connect. And I just wanted to kind of highlight this because it addresses some of the issues around data stewardship as it relates to what's needed to make things fair. FairConnect.pro is intended to be a platform where data stewards can publish their FAIR supporting resources, so sort of the things that they do for on a daily basis. They can publish their solutions to FAIR implementations, communicate them to others, and get citations for that. So we're trying to elevate the work of data stewardship to be really into a professional status. And here's an opportunity for them to have their own academic journal associated with that. This is a partnership between iOS Press, which is an open access publisher for 35 years, and the Go Fair Foundation. And I'm referencing at that URL the signing of an MOU between iOS Press and Go Fair. And then CoData, DTL, and HealthRI are now also partnering in co-development around the platform. And as I say, the main service that this platform can provide is a place to publish what we call FAIR supporting resources. And this is a list of resources that we see in data stewardship. These are kind of the bread and butter of data stewardship. It relates directly to FAIR implementations, but right now these things are almost invisible. And what we see is the reinvention of the wheel over and over and over again. So we're hoping, even the icon for Fair Connect is a wheel. We're trying to stop the reinvention of the wheel through accident or when it's done for no good reason. The last bullet point there is, we call it thumbnail articles. So this is not a journal where you would publish a full-length narrative research article. It's really these very short 3,000-word descriptions of your FAIR supporting resource. So it's a very practical, very down-to-earth data exchange, information exchange platform for the benefit of data stewardship with an emphasis on FAIR. I will just mention that what we can envision as a kind of sustainability model for the platform is what we call FAIR Connect channels. And so yeah, we think, okay, we want this to be open access, we want data stewards to avoid APC charges. How do we do this? We think that it's very nice if organizations, funding agencies, research organizations like universities or companies, they could purchase a channel environment on FAIR Connect. They can customize it with the FAIR supporting resources that make sense to them, and then the employees or the people working in that organization would have free access to publish and communicate on the platform. About 3.5 weeks ago, we kicked off FAIR Connect publicly because we wanted to make a presentation on October 25 at the Convergence Symposium that we had in Leiden. And we didn't really know where it was going to go. But in fact, within 2 weeks, we had over 60 people writing 17 short articles, often about FAIR supporting resources that they're busy working on. So this was a really satisfying response. People were very eager. We found authors, co-authors, and reviewers, so people who are reviewing the articles as well. And the links here at the bottom of the slide can get you to those articles if you want to read them. But we will, in the coming weeks, we're deploying the professional editorial managing platform to really make it into a publication with a DOI, et cetera. Okay, so that was some background on FAIR and a little bit about where FAIR implementation is at the moment. The last topic I wanted to mention was, what would FAIR science look like if we lived in a world where data and services were FAIR? Then what's possible? And I'm trying to show examples here that relate specifically to open and to the idea that some data cannot be open or need to be restricted, and how FAIR can help out here. FAIR is giving us an opportunity to approach data repositories in a much more distributed way and a much more decentralized way. And so this opens up a couple of opportunities. The top panel, I'm showing what we typically refer to as data sharing. And I hear the word data sharing much more often than I do data visiting. And I think it's kind of the classic ideas we have in mind. We want to share our data. But psychologically, that typically means we have data and I have to give it away, and then someone else has it. So there's this idea that we copy the data, we transport it, and then at that point, it's out of control. And if you're really giving away data that's somehow very sensitive, like for example, patient data, then that data's gone, and you're hoping that the third party is going to obey the licensing or destroy the data as some protocol. In contrast to that, the idea of data visiting, using, say, a FAIR data point or a FAIR data station would allow queries to come to the metadata, ask if the appropriate data resources for the query are at this location. If yes, then the algorithms would enter into a kind of negotiation for kind of automated access control, so that the data can be visited, but under well-defined conditions from certified algorithms, say. But then the data can be analyzed on that site without having to be copied. And in fact, analyses can run somewhat blinded, giving results back to the user in such a way that they may not even have to examine the data or the sensitive aspects of the data itself. So this is where the algorithms come to the data. It's not where you're copying the data and giving it away. And this was somewhat science fiction for a while. Here's an early, well, this is a still from a video, an early video on what we call the personal health train in the Netherlands. And the idea here is that you have these fair data stations that are specifying the conditions under which the data can be accessed. And then you have this, the algorithms that run on tracks, visiting data stations, knocking on the door and getting the appropriate access that they need to examine just the data that they need. These days, for example, I am involved on 2 projects funded by Health Holland, the Trusted World of Corona and the See for Yourself project. And that's an acronym for Citizen-Centered and Controlled COVID-19 Data. And the idea here is that in the bottom of the figure, each patient, or let's say each citizen in the Netherlands, would have their own medical data vault. So they actually capture their own medical data in their own PGO, it's called. On top of that would sit, in the purple box, metadata that describe what's there. The pink layer on top of that is the access control, and the consent for the reuse of that patient data is given by the patient himself or herself. This removes a third party, like a hospital, that is usually hyper-conservative and you know, under no circumstances will they ever permit easy access to patient data. But patients who have a motivated interest to have their data involved in research can give that consent, and it's much easier to then share, or we should say visit, that data. In the TWAC project, the application that we're building now is, we call it the TWAC cycle, but the idea here is that there's a series of steps that you would always go through if you have some sort of observation. You need to rationalize that, form a hypothesis, and then it's nice if you can test that hypothesis on real-world observational data, real-world patient data. So for example, you may have anecdotal observations. You're a physician working in a intensive care unit in a hospital, a pandemic comes along, and you begin to notice patterns in the patients. And you might say, well, you know, out of all the patients in the ICU, none of them are for whatever reason, on dexamethasone. In fact, anybody who's on dexamethasone for whatever reason seems to stay out of the ICU. Is there something valuable about this drug on this disease? In a world of interconnected fair data, you would be able to access what we call established knowledge, so peer-reviewed information, basically knowledge graphs, where you can perform queries to say, hey, what's the relationship between dexamethasone and, for example, other kinds of biochemical biomarkers that would be indicative of severe COVID. And so, for example, dexamethasone is known to lower prostaglandin E2 levels, which is an initiator of cytokine storms and severe COVID inflammation. So it would make sense that dexamethasone might have something to do with reduced severity of COVID. So you can then launch a hypothesis, or you have that hypothesis, you can then launch queries that can test that hypothesis. And so for example, you could say, I want to send a query to all the patients out there who are either in the ICU or not in the ICU, and whether or not they're taking dexamethasone, and if they've had, by the way, any PGE2 measurements from their blood or their urine. And if that's the case, you can actually put together then, like I say, a kind of virtual clinical trial, or you can at least get, in some cases, analytics back that you can test statistically and see if there is a correlation here. That's going to open up new questions, and so you can repeat the cycle again. But this is all made possible because you have knowledge graphs available to you that you can query just to rationalize what you see, and you can test those on real-world observational data that are coming in real time from real patients. There's another system like this that has been built by a group called the Virus Outbreak Data Network. This was a GoFair implementation network that launched in 2020 they now have a data visiting architecture in place in 88 health facilities in 8 African countries. And they're using custom-built and standard query mechanisms, but they've put together their own systems that are working and respecting the regulatory environments on patient data that exist in each of the 88 facilities and each of those 8 countries. So there's conditions under which the data can be accessed, and that's coming from the local authorities. It's nice to highlight a group that's working on building a fair network of rare disease registries. And this is a meeting coming up on the 22nd of November. And this is the 3rd international meeting of data visiting for the Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy group. And then I think it's really nice to highlight, to my knowledge, the most advanced form of this data visiting approach. And this is coming from your colleagues in Bonn, Joachim Schultz. And this is an attempt to show machine learning in a pretty sophisticated way over patient records while respecting patient privacy. So there's some examples of data visiting and kind of how FAIR can sort of solve this conundrum of research data that may not be immediately open and available. Just a couple more slides I wanted to highlight. Not last week, but the week before, in Leiden, we had our own FAIR Focus Week. So it reminds me a little bit of the Berlin week that you have here. And on Monday, Tuesday, we had a CoData Go FAIR conference on convergence, and that was very interesting. But Thursday, Friday was devoted to the first international conference on FAIR digital objects. And this was a really packed program, sometimes very technical, but also sometimes very high level, discussing an internet of FAIR data and services from the point of view that information objects on the network would somehow themselves be recognizable to the machine. And we would, in general, we refer to this as a FAIR digital object. So an agent can find these objects, interpret them, understand what they can do, and can process them. These could be data, these could be services, et cetera. Two of the headline speakers in the conference on FAIR digital objects was Bob Kahn and George Strawn. And Bob apologized that he wasn't able to be there in person, but he did say that, lucky for us, we have the internet. So this is a guy who communicated to us on TCP/IP, which he designed 53 years ago. But George Strawn was also there and had some words to say about how FAIR fits into the digital object architecture as well. And then lastly, that FAIR Focus Week ended Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock with the signing of the Leiden Declaration on FAIR digital objects. And I have a link here, and I'm just showing, it's really just a bullet point document that kind of lays out a case for building up standards around FAIR digital objects and what that might mean and how it compares to the early work of the internet, but also how it differs from the needs of semantically rich data. But you can check out the Leiden Declaration, and it's still possible for anyone here who's interested to sign that declaration. What it's done for the FDO forum and for this group, we've now launched a 1-year time span where interested groups can try out FDOs for themselves in various implementations, and we report back a year from now to share stories on implementations of FDOs. But it's really trying to move to the next level of the internet, where data and services are now much more autonomous and can do much of the backbreaking work that data stewards and data scientists are now asked to do. And with that, I say thank you very much for your attention and farewell.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for this nice overview and discussion of the different aspects. So are there questions? We have time for questions. Yes, please.
I have one question, and this was kind of remark. I believe that you interpreted your interpretation of the FAIR the FAIR principles.
Yep.
Referred immediately to the data objects you now introduced. Well, I don't think that the FAIR principles contain anything which points to the objects, the data objects you are proposing. So that was a kind of thing where I wanted to ask how you do this reading.
Yeah. There were interpretations even very early on after the paper was published that data was meant to reflect data in the broadest sense. So zeros and ones, bit sequences. So it was whether it was a data set, and a well-curated data set and marked up with metadata, or whether it was a service or it was executable code. At least these were interpretations that people gave early on. So to the degree that that works, then I think it comports pretty well to the FDO framework.
Okay, Andreas.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for this great talk and very good start of this day. I like very much the idea of FDOs, and the FDOs are, in a way, have the potential to combine the ideas of FAIR objects, as Harry Henkem just mentioned. These are somehow unrelated, in a way, to the implementation, but with the implementation activities, and this has, for me, the potential to be groundbreaking or to be, yes, extremely relevant. Is there some implementation work at your institution that is going to, in a way, highlight these technical aspects and help people to get, for instance, an FDO repository, FDO-aware repository and all these things? Is there some work done at the moment?
So I was lucky enough to have a presentation at the FDO forum, which was I mentioned briefly, if you recall, this idea of nanopublication. It was in the slide with Fair Connect. So if you're familiar with nanopublications, these are small pieces of RDF. There's an identifier. There's the essentially an assertion, a semantic assertion, in the simplest form, a subject, predicate, object, with some metadata around that. This data can be hashed and turned into the identifier, so there's a little bit of like a blockchain element to it. But anyways, nanopublications have been used for 10 years now in a wide variety of fields, and there's all kinds of very nice services that have grown up to process them. So there's a nanopublication server network out there. And we've been working more and more with nanopubs ourselves, and at one point we started to realize, well, a nanopublication configured a certain way, we think actually maps onto the FAIR digital object framework that Luis Bonino, for example, has sketched out in some detail. So we think, as far as we can push it today, that properly constructed nanopublications are actually implementations of a FAIR digital object for an assertion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another one, please.
We'll have good discussions in the afternoon, I think.
So I didn't just want to launch in this discussion about the FAIR digital objects, but I have to remark that the interpretation narrows down, in a way, the use of data in other communities. So it's not always possible to just make data into some magical object. There is a long way to go, and it's not, let's say, I was involved in a lot of discussion about this FDO thing. Mm-hmm. And for instance, in astronomy, we have a complete set of services which has another approach to this, and it's not just transformable, like, for instance, also the high energy physics or the whole natural science communities in the, or the high level physics. So there is some kind of difficulty if now FAIR is always connected with FDO.
Okay.
That's one point, and well, let's say I just wanted to state where this comes from, and this discussion, I think, is not at the end.
Yeah. May I ask, is some of the reservation you have having to do with the type specificity, the type specification of an FDO? Because I know this is still an outstanding issue. But maybe we come back to it later. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can discuss this. I have actually a question regarding the FAIR Connect.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that there is a reviewing process, so to get the material on the platform. So could you briefly explain how this works?
Yeah. So I don't know if we've arrived at a solution yet. We've opened up the discussion. It's for the community also to partake in, so you can participate as well. But we have this idea that we don't really want kind of a classic peer review of an article, because these are more of just kind of informative exchanges on practical things. So we think of it more as like community approval rather than peer review. It's some other set of criteria on these short articles and on the publication of these elements, just to give an indication how widely used these resources are, or what kind of benefits they may have to the community. So yeah, we're trying to figure out criteria by which we can review in a meaningful way to drive convergence on implementations, these FAIR supporting resources. But right now, just for the sake of launching this, we were able to find, in every case, 2 people who were willing to review one of these 17 articles. And so that was also, to me, a bit of a surprise. But because the articles are short, we think we can also have a rapid turnaround time in FAIR Connect, that from the time you submit to the time you get a DOI might be 6 days or 10 days, something like that. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Alexander?
Thank you very much. I have a question on the role of data and software. As we all know, data works best with software, and in some cases, data is meant to be visualized or to be interacted with in a certain way. Yeah. Or when you think of reproducibility, then you could add a certain amount of trust to a data set when you preserve the software with which the data was generated as well. So you talked a lot about the data, but not about software.
Yeah.
So is this topic something you discuss in the FAIR community? Or is this something you summarize under FAIR data objects? Of course, you can just say software is data, and everything which is meant for data is also valid for software.
Yeah.
But is it that simple?
Well, so good question, and I think maybe we're going to have our topic for the afternoon. But you know, the RDA, the Research Data Alliance, has a working group specifically on FAIR and its relation to software. So there's been a couple different independent attempts to try and figure out what FAIR means at the level of preservation of kind of software functionality. So there are groups working on that. Yeah. And certainly through the use of identifiers, you know, you can try and keep things interconnected, right? Yeah.
Okay, so at the moment I don't see any other question, then thanks again.
Okay,
thanks
yeah, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, and we move now on to our second speaker, who is Matthias Scheffler, Matthias Scheffler is a physicist. He has made seminal contributions to the development and application of density functional theory. This is his main area of research. He has been a director at the Fritz-Haber-Institut here in Berlin, and he is a distinguished visiting professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Matthias is a pioneer in data-centric methods in materials research, and he serves as director of the NOMAD Lab. This is a joint endeavor of the Fritz-Haber-Institut, or Max-Planck-Gesellschaft, and Humboldt University. And he is now also a co-chair of the FAIRMAT consortium, which is an NFDI consortium which is located at Humboldt University. Matthias will talk on data-centric research, natural sciences. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So you see the title, not yet. Data-centric materials research in the natural sciences. Let me briefly explain this title. Now, data-centric, I mean, data, or let's put it this way, science was always based on data and always will be based on data. With data-centrics, we mean a radical shift in how information is handled and research is being performed. Data-centric refers to extensive data collections, digital repository, and new concepts of methods of data analytics. It also implies that we advance the traditional purpose-oriented research. We had used the term repurposable, whereas in the later FAIR definition they use reusable. It's the same thing which we mean. We mean that you can really use data in a different context. And let me just illustrate that for some example from material science. Titanium dioxide is really a material very often used for many things. It's used, for example, for heterogeneous catalysis as a support material. And if someone publishes results on titanium dioxide in the heterogeneous catalysis sector, other people cannot really do very much with this data. On the other hand, titanium dioxide is very important for new type of solar cells, and in fact it's also very important for the white, for pigmentation, for the white in the color in paints, but actually also for the white in toothpaste and sunscreens. And obviously, if it would be possible that we could use data more widely, and that means actually repurposable, if we really also start doing our research not really so narrowly and thinking only about one purpose, that would serve really the whole community significantly. So I will talk about natural sciences. Now this is a very wide area. It has many fields: chemistry, physics, engineering, life sciences. And in fact, even in these fields, there are subfields. So there is pure and applied mathematics, there is earth sciences, there is astrophysics, and there are many aspects of engineering sciences. And also life sciences, of course, is very broad. I mean, biology, medicine. So it's an enormous field, and I'm not able really to cover that in this talk. I will really focus later in giving examples where the challenges are and actually where the chances are from the field of science of materials, which covers certain aspects of physics, chemistry, and engineering. I will not discuss biology and medicine, but I will mention some analogies. Now, the critical importance of data collection, open research data, and sharing has been well recognized since the early times of science. And a familiar example is the tense relationship between Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. And I just really want to mention that because to some extent we still have that nowadays, and we still have to educate really also our community. The former, Tycho Brahe, had comprehensively really studied the motion in astronomy of objects. He had the best data at the time, but he guarded them very carefully. He wanted to interpret the data himself. Kepler was probably the best mathematician of the time, and he wanted really to have this data, but he didn't get them. Only late in his life, Tycho Brahe invited Kepler to become his assistant, then Brahe's untimely death, about 1 year after Kepler arrived, gave Kepler all the chance to get access to all the data of Tycho Brahe. Now, there was an accusation that Kepler may have killed Brahe to get the data, but actually that was later actually shown to be unfounded. But the relatives of Tycho Brahe really sued Kepler that he had stolen the data. Whatsoever. I mean, after Brahe's death, based on his data, Kepler developed what is now known the laws of planetary motion, the Kepler laws. And so despite the tense relationship between these two gentlemen, they are honored here together in this monument. Each alone would not have really achieved what they achieved together. So converting information, what they have done later, in fact, not a little bit later, helped or was a basis for Isaac Newton to develop his laws of gravitation. Now, converting information into laws, into analytic equations, this is what is now called theoretical physics. And other people one should mention in this context would be Galileo Galilei and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Having partial differential equation, this was the way theoretical physics is going, and this is the way how we, for a long time, really were or are understanding science. Now, Brahe and Kepler is an example from astrophysics, but let me now focus on material science, and let me just actually briefly say actually why, what is material science and why is it important. The prosperity and the lifestyle which we have here of our society are very much governed by achievements in material science, because new products for sectors like energy, environment, health, mobility, information technology largely rely on improved or even new materials which we didn't know actually before. Examples include solar state lighting, or solar cells, touch screens, batteries, also implants in medicine like teeth and artificial hips, and also drug delivery and more. Now, so far, actually, this is just really just a picture from the MIS website. So far, we know about 250,000 materials. But in fact, we know that these materials could be created, but we don't know really the properties. But that is also nothing to what is possible. If you look at the 100 atoms of the periodic table and combine them according to what crystallography would actually tell us is possible, the number of possible materials is probably infinite. And that tells that in this enormous pool of possibilities, there is a chance that we can find materials which are better than what we are using today for making light, for making photovoltaics, and so on. The problem is that the materials we are interested in are what we call statistically exceptional. They are very rare. So even if there's an infinite number of possibilities, the materials which are a good catalyst for a certain chemical reaction, maybe just a handful of possibilities. So how to find that? And one way to solution is to create materials maps of materials properties. And that means finding a descriptor, an x and a y-axis. We don't know these axes yet. Finding a descriptor D1 and D2, and if we have found them, then the materials we are interested in will probably cover in this huge space of possible materials very small areas. So thermal barrier coatings, things which really don't conduct heat, or better photovoltaics. So that is the idea. Can we find actually a map of materials to, and using really the data, which are hopefully open, to create maps and then to zoom into what is more important, what is important. Now that brings us to what is called the fourth paradigm of materials research. Now I should first maybe briefly say what are the first three. The first one is the experimental or empirical physics. The second one is theoretical physics, the concept that everything, the laws exist which can be expressed in terms of partial differential equations. The third one is based on the fact that these equations look simple, at least to me, but you cannot solve them. for a realistic system. And so the only way to solve them is really using big computers, and that is called simulations, using computers and using numerical solutions of this thing, of these equations, like an experiment. Now the fourth paradigm now says there is more than analytic equations. There are relationships in nature which can only be described in terms of correlations. And that means we also give up a little bit, quite significantly, the old concept of causation. So if there is really a result, correlations means something really correlates with what we are interested in, but the reliability or we are not complete, I mean, it's only a probability which we can say that this happens with a certain probability. So we're giving up, or we're changing causation into a statistical causation. That means that these correlations we usually call rules, no longer laws. As I said, they have only a statistical meaning. They only tell us with 90% of a chance, actually this property, this will be a good solar cell. And it can be described in terms of materials, very elementary materials properties, which we call materials genes. And here we have the analogy to biology. It's like genes in biology, where 100 genes, or more than 100, determine with a certain probability what is the hair color of a person. Or actually a couple of genes tells what is the probability that a person gets Parkinson's disease or cancer and so on. So it's this type of relationship which we now in fact are using also in material science in saying there are probabilities and there are basic elementary properties. So how are we doing this? Of course, I mean, the reason why I'm here is you need data for that, and you need, in fact, an efficient and open data infrastructure. You cannot just use it with your own data. That wouldn't really not enough. So we started that concept of building such a data infrastructure together with Claudia Draxel about 10 years ago, and we went online 2014 in the so-called NOMAD repository. NOMAD stands for Novel Materials Discovery. And what we did is we invited everyone on this planet, actually everyone in our field, that means in computational material science, to upload their data into the NOMAD repository. Now, upload, and we promised that we keep these data for 10 years, and we said we only need the data the way your computer code is producing them. I mean, if you don't make it easy to the researcher, they will not see actually that is good for them. So basically upload your data as your code is doing this. There are 50 different computer codes. They all speak somewhat a different language. They have different units. They have different meaning of their parameters. So this repository where we now have, and we have actually more than 12 million files on this thing. You would only actually make sense of it if you are really an expert. The upload of a certain code will only tell you something if you really know the code. But in fact, we also said we don't want really the data. We want the full input file and the full output file and the full description of the software which you are using. So all this is really here, but it's only really usable for the experts. But then we are doing the work. So now we are processing all the data. We are reading the data. We're converting them to a standard. So then in the archive, the data are now no longer dependent on the computer code, but they really can be used for anyone in a general sense. And on this archive, we now have something like 12 billion data. So the community has really accepted that after some start, of course, in doing this, uploading the data, the full input and output file, though that we can also see for what type of question the data are really good. We also, in fact, say if you don't want to make it public immediately and you want to only use this service for your colleagues and you, there is an embargo period for 3 years, so it's only open after a certain couple of years. That also actually has been a very useful thing, although it's not so often really used. If you would like to read about the concept, Claudia Draxel and I have written that in a Nature perspective. So usually you submit a paper to Nature and then it's rejected, people tell me. In this case, actually, Nature asked us to write this paper. So, and we did not reject, but we accepted writing a paper. And so that describes really the concept which is behind this thing, and in fact the other things which come in a moment. So at this point, this is the biggest database in computational material science. And what drives us, why are we doing this, is what was in fact also briefly mentioned. The data should be fair in the sense Eric has told us, but actually we think the data should be fair that you can repurpose them, and that in fact means you can use them for artificial intelligence. So our forward-looking view is actually more they should be findable and AI ready. And that of course is what we have done. And these things together, each alone would not be really fair, but these things together in fact would be fair in the way we have just heard it from Eric's talk. Now, we are so big because we are doing this also together with our American friends. The big three repositories in the US are also actually basically present on this NOMAD database. Now, with the NFDI, we started in expanding that together with Claudia Draxel to the experimental work, making also data from the experimental synthesis and experimentation available. I can tell you this is an enormous amount of work. So one should not underestimate that. I mean, in computational material science, I would say it's not a big deal. I mean, you have an input and an output file, but you don't have an input file in experiments, right? I mean, describing really this sample is a lot of work, and in the work to make data fair, we should not underestimate that, and we should really make sure that people who do this get all the support they need. So, having this now, the data really in a good way machine readable, we also have what we call the encyclopedia. This is, say, the human way to look at the data, because humans also would like to look at the data. So you can ask for a band structure, for a band gap, good for photovoltaic. You can look for, say, specific heats and so on. And we offer what we call the artificial intelligence toolkit, where we offer software, which we also try to do in the FAIR concept, software which have also a DOI, which people can use for artificial intelligence on the data of the repository, and where the software people can also change because they may have a slightly different question, so they can also adjust it to their question. So that is somewhat what we have built up over the last 10 years so far. And I would like to really show you one example now. Maybe I briefly mention what we have done with this already, and then I show you more qualitatively one other example. So we want to use this infrastructure for machine learning or for artificial intelligence, building maps of material properties to see where are the new materials which could help us for an improved environment or lifestyle. So building maps of material properties. When I started that, my role model was to some extent the Mendeleev's idea of the periodic table of the elements. When Mendeleev started, he knew about 60 atoms. And he knew the weight of the atoms, and he knew the chemical properties, the reactions of these atoms. And with this knowledge, he put these things in some order. And there he saw actually there must be other atoms. He saw actually there were several white spots in this, on this table. I think gallium was, for example, missing. But he knew there must be an atom. I mean, it wasn't called gallium because it wasn't there. But there must be an atom. And he even could say, what are the properties of this atom? And so having really a map which tells us there is something interesting, this is what we want. So Mendeleev started with 60, we now have more than 100 atoms. Now in material science we have infinite. Now that is a much bigger deal to deal with, and so therefore we also not really at the end. So this is just really ongoing research. But we have used that, for example, creating a map. And so this is the type of map we are doing. It has an x-axis, so descriptor 1, and an y-axis, descriptor 2. These descriptors, I don't really show them here, only depend on the atomic properties. And basically, and these only depend on the material's genes. And if we have a certain gene, then we know actually this material is, for example, here, and then we can say this material will have this and this structure. So creating or making predictions about crystal structures, even if you don't calculate them, we have done this for octet binaries, for some very hot new type of oxides, which could be a new class of semiconductors, for perovskites, and so on. We looked also at topological insulators to see which materials are topological insulators, or in fact, maybe actually just regular insulators or metals. We looked into catalysis, and we looked, and this is what I just want to give you in the last 3 minutes, an example for thermal conductivity. So thermal conductivity means actually how well a material is conducting heat. There are examples where there are questions where you want materials which do not conduct heat. I mean, for example, if you fly in an airplane during liftoff, the airplane engine is hotter than the melting temperature. Now, of course, I think you don't want that it melts when you fly. So there is a very thin layer of thermal barrier coating, which really just prevents that this thing melts. That the heat can go through. And the reason that you want to run this so warm, so hot, is in fact that you have a good conductivity, that you have a good efficiency of fuel. Other things are thermal electric devices. So 50% of all the energy which we consume is wasted in terms of heat. And so the idea is, can you bring the heat back into electricity? You can in principle, but we don't know which material is doing this efficiently. You want a low heat conducting material. So what we have done is, we used the materials, the experimental materials which we could find, and used artificial intelligence, and with this we found actually this map, descriptor 1, descriptor 2, which the descriptors again depend only on materials genes. I'll tell you them in a moment. And they give us, with the AI, this type of map. They tell us regions where you have very good thermal conductivity and regions where you have very bad thermal conductivity. You see, a very good thermal conductor, maybe actually the best, is carbon in the diamond structure. But in fact, we are really interested here where we don't have actually many examples. And so the artificial intelligence gives us an equation. Again, this is an equation, but it has only a statistical meaning in terms of a correlation. It gives us this correlation behavior, and a constant, another constant plus this descriptor, another constant plus another descriptor, D1 and D2. These are the X and Y axis. These D1 and D2 are functions of intrinsic, basic physical parameters characterizing the material's properties. So these are the material. So these are the materials genes. And what we find here, there are just 3 genes. There is what is called the anharmonicity score, so how anharmonic are the vibrations in the system. There is the molar volume, just adding the volumes from the atoms. And there is what is called the high temperature limit of the Debye temperature. Quantities which you could get easily, actually much more easily, still you need to do some work on it, but actually much more easily than getting rid of the thermal conductivity. And now having this map and knowing actually that we only need these 3 quantities, we looked in the spirit of having open databases, we looked really around, and we found 32 known materials in this materials project. This is from our American colleagues in Berkeley. We looked for these materials just actually where these 3 genes are, and from this graph here, from this map, we could find that 15 of these genes are in fact in this interesting region. So without any other work, we have a prediction that one should look first at these 15 things to find something which is low thermal conductor. And then for some of them, we did actually these very expensive calculations and confirmed that in this case, the prediction was right. But you don't want to calculate everything because it's extremely expensive. But if you really can bring it down with this open exchange of data, you have a big advantage. So let me come to an end with 2 slides. So we are looking, made by this open data, we are coming to a paradigm shift by data-centric material science. We are looking now more into correlations, because in just finding structure in big data sets tells us about correlations versus causation. So we're changing the way we are looking at physics. As I said, we want to make data findable and AI ready. That means also they are fair in the standard way of fairness we had discussed in the previous talk. For doing this and helping the community, you will only get the community on board if you convince them this is useful and if you don't make it too complicated. And this thing is complicated, particularly for the experimental world. We built in our field this data infrastructure with a repository and archive, this encyclopedia and the big data analytics. That is now available, again, in our field, also really as a local server. If people don't want to share yet, they can actually also run this locally. But if you have this, then with this artificial intelligence toolkit, we offer methods for smarter knowledge extraction from complex data sets to build this type of maps which tell us where should we dig in. More deeply. And I showed you this example from the thermal conductivity using different data sets. Now, I think we should change our publication culture. I think, again, this has to do, so far you have a research project and that goes about one problem and you just solve this problem. And then it's published really for this problem with what I would call very often with a fishy interpretation. Honestly, we don't know, we don't need these interpretations, but we would need, in fact, data which are in detail characterized. This is an enormous work. Publishing what we call actually clean data, data which are very well characterized. We should acknowledge that. And we should acknowledge that people really just publishing data and describing them well, that they should really also be appreciated, having a very big contribution. And I think that's why I already told you about Brahe and Kepler, right? I mean, Brahe is really famous because this data were really crucial, but the interpretation was done by someone else. And in the same spirit, I just want to finish with saying we did something along this line in what is called the Kaggle competition in 2018. Kaggle is an internet platform. By now, it's actually called, bought by Google. It's an internet platform of the machine learning community. And so what we have done is we had actually 3,000 materials of aluminum, gallium, indium oxide, and we have cohesive energies, which tells you about the stability, and we had band gaps, which tells you how good this is for optoelectronics. And we published these data there and made a competition and said, who can come up with a good machine learning model to predict actually what material, which we have not calculated beyond the 3,000, is actually a good material. We offered 5,000 euro for the winner and invited this winner also to a conference. Within 2 months, 900 different contributions were submitted to really explain what you can do with the data. And the winner came up with a method which we didn't know before. So I think just accepting, right? I mean, if you have data and you describe them well, just really use this potential of people on this planet and let the interpretation done by someone else. You still should get the credit, of course. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Matthias, for this nice and also motivating talk. Reinhold.
Yes, thank you very much. I have 2 questions. One is maybe you could just quickly say how you get from the repository to the archive. Is that done by you, or is it done in cooperation with the people who submit the data?
It's done by us largely. So actually for the first 40 computer codes, it was done completely by us. Of course, sometimes asking really the developer of the computer code if he were not sure. But we had actually funding in the beginning from a European Center of Excellence, and now it's funded by this national data infrastructure. So we have people, if there is a new code coming up, we in fact do it now together with the code developer. But we have the infrastructure that now it actually can be done within 1 or 2 weeks. I mean, in the beginning, of course, it took much longer.
Okay. And my second question goes to Brahe and Kepler. So it's one of my favorite examples. I use it actually myself a lot. And I've always wondered if, and I don't know, I haven't checked the literature lately, whether there has been an attempt to come up with Kepler's laws using machine learning on the Brahe data, you know, in a way talking about your correlation, causation, because to me anyway, for a long time, I always thought that there was really, you know, exactly the insight of Kepler was really needed to make sense of it. And if you just sort of go by regression, by correlations, you get thrown away by the epicycles, and you never come up with the beauty of the Kepler equation. So I was wondering whether you thought about that.
No, I think it's a very good question, because it shows you also the limits of machine learning. There is actually a paper, at least I think, on the archive. I'm not sure if it's really published, which came up, I think it was with second law of Kepler. The problem is, in fact, that machine learning with the data of Kepler would, in fact, fail at the moment, because you first, that of course what the data of Brahe, what Kepler first did is transforming it really into a different coordinate system. And then you see the structure. Before you don't see the structure, and before you cannot really interpolate. And this transformation to spherical harmonics in this is actually something which machine learning is still not actually able to do alone. So I think natural intelligence is still actually an advantage compared to artificial.
Okay, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two brief questions as follow-up. One with respect to the journal call for data publications. In your field, are there outlets that allow that already? And
yes.
Is there sort of a template? That's
yes.
the one question. The other question is, I looked at your website. I felt like you mentioned initially that there is a possibility to indicate what the data are useful for, and I couldn't really find that on your website as one of the metadata information. Did I mishear that, or in which format would that be provided?
Okay, let me first, the first thing, there is actually a journal which is called Nature Scientific Data, say from Nature, so actually a high level if you want, where essentially you actually publish data with a short description what the data really mean. And you also have to provide the data in some of the official repositories, and NOMAD is one of them, if you are in material science. So yes, there is actually a good journal. Nature actually realized that pretty early, that this is a new direction to go. Now the second question was for what the data are useful. We are not saying this at the moment, and it's really somewhat also dedicated. I mean, so the way we really want to say that data have a use, and you don't really know for what they are used at the end. They should be described in the way that the person doing, say, new solar cells can use them, but a person who's doing a thermoelectric device can use them. They should be described that everyone can really use them, and this is what we are doing. Still, and that comes to data quality. We want the full input and the full output file. And I think Eric has said that data may be good actually for a certain purpose, but they may be not so good for another purpose. And so really, so we would never say that these data are bad, but we would say these data are good for this purpose and not so good for the other one. Because as soon as we make a classification in bad and good, actually people will not upload anymore. But I think all the data, because they are characterized completely with the full input and output file, all data are valuable. Even if you would say actually they are not useful for what you are interested in, they are still valuable. So we would like really to emphasize this repurposable aspect. You should use the data for something else. And we should, at some point, we're still debating how we should do this, classify and tell people a little bit for what are they useful and for where should you be careful.
Okay, Franziska Böhm, please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So I'm a lawyer, so I see it maybe a bit differently. And I was asking myself all the time, because we are dealing with that in some of the NFDI consortia, how do you deal with industry interest? And how do you deal with it? Are they involved? Can they use the results like for free? And are researchers giving you the data in fear maybe that they are not misused, but further used by industry? And how do you deal with that?
So industry, I mean, we have a very strong industry board, in fact. So industry is for sure very interested in the data. And for sure they will not give us their data. I mean, but you have to understand that, because, I mean, at the end, industry has to survive and pay their people, and you don't want to really bring them into bankruptcy. So honestly, I accept that. Now, we have some industry collaborations. And there, in fact, before we start, we insist that these data should be published, maybe with a delay of 1 year. But if we have a collaboration, at least in the Max Planck Society or in my group, we just have this condition before we start with industry making something together. That they should be published, but a delay of 1 year I would accept.
Okay, brief final question, please.
First off, one small comment to Brahe versus Kepler. Brahe was a supporter of the Ptolemaic system.
Sure.
So his recognition of the Kepler laws was clearly very much hampered by the way he looked at his data.
Yeah.
So that's one very important point you made in the context of
I didn't have the time to say that. He basically had this geocentric view, and that's why he really getting along with this. But one also had to say the Kepler laws came 20 years after actually the death.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was, but that's why he wanted to interpret it in his view. But this is, everyone is doing somewhat, having some constraints, right?
I agree. The other point I want to mention is, and that's also well kind of hidden in that what Eric was showing, how much importance we have to make on proper curation and deliverance of the data in an open way, in that sense that it's not already interpreted for a certain aspect. That goes into the findability, where I think that machine learning algorithms will do something for us, but that's something we still need to explore. But it also points there that you can't just state that a certain data has to be an object without giving the software, without giving the context.
No, but that is actually why in the computational material science we request the full input file, all the information about the software and the output file. And fairness is only reached by a repository, the raw data, and the normalized data together. Alone it would not be there because you wouldn't actually know what is the correlation, what is the accuracy of the data. Doing this in experimental physics, and this is what we are discussing at the moment, in really seeing, and we call this, we want clean data, and that means actually well-characterized data. You need to go, and in Germany, in fact, most people are still using their notes actually handwritten. You have to go to electronic notebooks, right? I mean, there's a lot of changes we have to do, and we're helping people. And I can tell you in this Fermat consortium, there's a lot of progress in having clean data and having really electronic lab books, but it's a long way. And we have to make sure that this way is funded, and we have to make sure that not the PhD student and the postdoc has to do more work on that, right?
Okay. Eric, you have to say something, quick one?
Just a brief follow-up on that. The hard work that the data steward or the postdoc or the graduate student does on this cleaning of the data, especially when there's a nice success story that you can tell, I think this is a perfect contribution to Fair Connect. We really want to highlight and put the spotlight on the work that these people are doing and really try to elevate it to something. They can get citations for this, right? They should be well respected for that kind of work because it's very demanding.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and people who do this should get really the full credit, right?
Okay, so.
There's one more. Basically. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, at the end, we should cite really the people who really created the data. And I think in Brahe and Kepler, we know actually what Brahe has really done, although he had this geocentric view.
Okay, I think we really have to move on. Thanks a lot, Matthias. Okay, our next speaker is Frauke Kreuter from the LMU in Munich. She holds the chair of statistics and data science in social sciences and humanities there. And she's also a faculty member in the joint program in survey methodology at the University of Maryland. She has made important contributions to survey and data science, and her research, at least as I understand it, has also a strong methods component. She has been a key contributor to the NFDI consortium BERD, which is located in Mannheim. And the title of her talk is Keeping the Algorithm in Mind When Analyzing Business and Economic Data, Experiences from BERD at NFDI. Please.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for asking the question earlier, what about the software? I noticed that the discussion went more in types of software being used or certain variants of a software being archived alongside, since that is changing, and therefore the results. I'll have a slightly different focus on software, which means the actual code and algorithms used to create such data. And what I want to highlight is, and this question was actually one of the motivating factors why we put the BERD proposal in as part of the NFDI context. And for those of you not familiar with all these acronyms, so by putting this business and economic related data, national research data infrastructure proposal in. The context in which I work or deal with data can be nicely summarized here with this overview slide of official statistics agencies and related people trying to use increasingly unstructured data to describe what's going on in the world, either at the macro level or at the micro level. I'll come to micro in a moment. Whether this is Statistic Netherlands in the first panel that use data from telecommunication companies to visualize commuting patterns, whether this is satellite data that are increasingly used to measure poverty or provide poverty estimates and assess changes of poverty over time, or increasingly also used in the US, here in Germany for a little bit longer, and certainly in the Nordic countries even longer than that, data traces from administrative records. All of them share that they are largely unstructured, so they're not as nicely captured by metadata, certainly hardly any standards around how they should be archived, and more importantly, there is often a much heavier pre-processing step going on than with any of the other data that we collect. I mentioned this also happens at the microdata level. Increasingly, we see studies like this one here, highlighted from the Institute for Employment Research here in Germany, that basically went back to the 30s, but in a new version. Meaning, instead of having researchers doing almost anthropological studies, going into a town, monitoring what's happening, as it was the case in a town in Austria in the 30s, popular study among sociologists called Marienthal, where the effects of a large layoff were monitored and captured over the course of 6 months by a team of sociologists and psychologists. And so what the IRB did a few years ago was to launch an app that people could have on their phone in their pocket, which does the same type of monitoring, measuring the speed with which people walk, measuring interactions that they have on their phone with others and things like that. To see if the same effects hold true, participation in the society and its consequences if that goes down for re-employment or the lack of re-employment. On the right, you see some, crude measures of sort of step counts for employed and unemployed, or people currently in the labor force and outside the labor force, larger differences between the two groups among the males than among the females. I'll leave it to your interpretation on why that might be the case. But what is interesting here is that this exciting data to collect in the social sciences are increasingly in that space, but a lot of decisions have to be made to even get to this simple descriptive point. And if you think of other sensors that are built into the phones, for example, just the pure opening and closing of an app on the left-hand side, you see over the course of 24 hours, every minute of the day, for a sample of 10 people each, color-coded the app that was opened and closed, and then on the right-hand side, a summary statistic, or actually, a little bit more than that, in terms of post-processing, the use of apps that on the top part that are work-related, and on the lower panel those that are entertainment-related, divided by these three groups. In blue, the full-time employed; in green, the part-time employed; and in orange, the ones in between. And besides the amusing fact that the entertainment apps are used by all three groups roughly similarly over the course of the day, this type of measurement is, can be incredibly insightful for social science research, and we don't yet have good ways to capture that. This becomes even more important, and we heard a couple of points to that effect earlier in the discussion, as we move towards not just macroeconomic description of society, but as these data are used for micro-level prediction, as we see this a lot discussed also in the labor market context on who should be given a certain job suggestion, or support for participation in a labor market program, or even on the commercial side, who gets which advertisement for a job. All of these are algorithmic-driven decisions. And very little is often known about these algorithms. And so if you think of that process that we discuss in the open science community, we focus a lot on making the output data available for everybody, right? That's sort of everyone agrees on that, and open data, or maybe behind a firewall, but fair data and understandable and whatnot. And then sometimes, and certainly for all GitHub aficionados, the analysis code also, is something that we tend to share much more. But a lot less attention is paid to what are the input data that go in, what are the input data that did not go in, and all the processing that happens on the input data around. And for me, particularly important in the social science context, all the decisions we people make along the way on doing that, and the documentation of these decisions. And so on the analysis and computation side, many of you who work with AI models or machine learning models know that that code for that's only like a tiny part, right, in this whole process, and we'll come to the rest. But even that has a whole bunch of decisions that need to be made, that need to be documented somewhere. And most of the data repositories, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with you guys later on, are not set up yet to handle that part. It's hard enough to handle the data, but how to properly archive algorithms and decisions for that, is a challenge I think we all still face. Which can be very important if you think of algorithm decision making that has then life-changing effects, as in being imprisoned or not, or your sentencing lengths, or in this case, a decision on what kind of job training program or support you should get downstream. These kinds of decisions, this is not just a scientific exercise to think about that. There are many OECD countries in which these decision-making systems have been implemented. We looked at this for Germany in somewhat more detail using the sample of integrated employment biographies, which is provided by the Institute for Employment Research for academic purposes. And we played around a little bit on the effects of these decisions downstream, those decisions that are often not well documented, or certainly not the alternatives. We used data for about 6 years with the predictor of sort of long-term unemployment, meaning being unemployed longer than 12 months. And I just want to give you a visual impression on sort of the variation that you see here. Certainly depending on what kind of policy should be put in place, whether someone gets support or not, has a big effect. But then all the other dots that you see in these dot plots on the false negative and false positive rates among various subgroups are just simple decision makings that we would call tuning parameters in these models, right? So there can be quite a bit of variation among those, and it becomes more obvious in this graph here, where folks from the US at CMU did a similar attempt to highlight decisions made in the credit scoring context. These are models with and without marital status and race. That's the small and full that you see down here on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, the acceptance rate for getting a credit or not. So having a good credit score, meaning accepted for a loan. And then highlight in each of the panels the difference between males and females. And, you know, for the overall model, there's certainly a difference detectable here. But these differences look very different depending on which subgrouping people look at. If you look at those just below high school degrees, or a combination of those above bachelor degrees but unmarried and the like, right? And so if we think of fair now in the fair, as in, you know, the former use of the word, there would certainly be things here to be detected, you know, that might lead to changes in the algorithm downstream, to changes in the data plus algorithm product that gets used. But they can only be, you know, shed light on if part of the data set or known in the data set these various aspects of the interaction between algorithm and data, or ideally the input data, not just the output data stream. Any evaluation of that, of course, has, and people often point to ethics when it comes to the other part of fairness. I'm not going to go into detail, but that is enabling that kind of discussion with the data that we archive, I think, is very important. I want to highlight a couple of decisions on the input stream as well. We all know, or we all have devices on us at some point, unfortunately, part of a medical system that creates data on us. And we do know that, you know, it's not available to everybody. You know, not everybody has devices on them all the time. Not everybody signs all consent forms at every step in the process in a interaction with a hospital or a doctor, and then inevitably data is missing. And so that too is part of the documentation process. And oops, I moved too fast. And the question for me often is how much, like, so we get the data set and we get the description on who is in there, but we don't necessarily force folks to give a description of from whom were data not collected, right? It's left to the user of the data downstream. But, you know, aside from maybe in the survey context, this notion of, you know, a gross sample and then the resulting respondents that you have, and maybe some estimates about non-response bias, you know, in that community that might, you know, be cultivated, but data on those is often not available. It's, you know, and many metadata standards lack even the language to capture the uncaptured data, right? And so I do want to point that out as one of the other areas where improvements, or where there's still room for improvement, I guess. On the algorithmic side, you know, when we think of that, you know, I'm not even sure how to put that in words myself, but you see ample examples like this one here done by the Bayerischer Rundfunk, where they nicely demonstrate that social science indicators derived from these unstructured data, in this case a video stream of a job interview, with the output of the Big Five indicator, that's a psychological classification of our openness and extroversion and neuroticism and things of that nature. And what you see here is that the classification of these 5 psychological constructs changed quite a bit, but not because the person said anything different or moved anything different, only because there was a picture hanging behind them in the background, meaning there were training data involved that probably scored higher differently for people that would record such things in homes with pictures on the wall versus those in homes with no pictures on the wall. Now, where is that in the resulting data? How would you know? How would you even know, right? If you don't have access to the training data in addition to the actual data that you provide in the repository, you couldn't even try to find this out, you know, unless you sort of stumble upon this effect like they did here, right? And so, as we move towards more and more data being created through algorithms, so we're not even talking about algorithms being used to create the results, but the data processing upfront being created with algorithms, we have to keep those kind of examples in mind. And that includes information on how training data were collected. You know, there are many different approaches to that. often they are farmed out to online services for annotation, whether this is picture or text. There are, people or companies who provide that as a business to do annotations, and that certainly can be done in less sensitive context, for example, tweets. But these annotations, too, are subject to measurement error. We did a series of experiments where we changed how the annotation task was done. Whether, we ask, next to each other that gave the possibilities to say this is a tweet that shows hate speech versus this is a tweet that shows offensive language, and let annotator decide that, which gave us a distribution like the blue one up here. But when you ask them separately for each tweet how they would evaluate, and if you change the order of these tweets, then all of a sudden you see a different distribution of whether they are hate speech or offensive language, right? So all of these are data generating processes that can have downstream effects. And the question is, how do we best capture decisions made in the data collection process so that those people that analyze the data afterwards are informed enough? And, in the end, also those people that are affected by data used or by decisions made with these algorithms, how they would trust us along the way. And we have, this is, just for kicks less so with the open data context, but we've recently done some vignette experiments where we ask people how they would feel about decisions made coming out of data or coming out of data in combination with decisions in combination of an algorithm and a human, and in various different contexts. The banking context that I showed before, where we have loan provisions, the labor market context, the juridical context, and the unemployment context. And it varies much by context on how comfortable people feel that algorithms are used in conjunction with the data. But a lot, my interpretation of this is sort of areas in which we're used to this, or in which we can imagine this can work versus not, right? But be it as it may, in order to capture the trust of the ones affected, and with data that affect the social sciences, those would be people, right? I mean, the atoms might not complain, but the peoples might, right? In the end, this transparency becomes even more important, and we see that discussion for that reason surrounded in the statistical agencies. And so what I've seen increasingly happen, I want to give an example from the US here, where statistical agencies that try to use the data that they have from administrative processes more in the context of algorithmic decision making, or just a new form of describing the world, they very much felt the need to not only have a repository that is suited to have these sensitive microdata, but that has the opportunity to provide sufficient transparency on anything that was done with the data. What kind of pre-processing, post-processing, what kind of algorithms were used, what kind of code was used to the data, so that trust can be established on the results that flow out of it. In BERD, we hope to create similar environments. For those of you not familiar with the various NFDIs, this is a consortium led by the University of Mannheim, in conjunction with the University of Hamburg, LMU and Cologne, but also other key players like GESIS and the Mannheim University Library. To summarize here, in the past, at least in the social sciences, we would have, always the starting point being serval and experimental data, meaning there was a lot of decision making and documentation going on the experimental design and on the questionnaire, and what, how was the question formulated, what were the answer categories, and yada, yada, yada. That's fine. And then then the archiving is still a lot of work. Heads off to all of the archives that do that. But as we think of text and language and images and data coming from IoT devices being the main piece of input, they might be pretty easy to capture, but it's even more work to do the kind of transparent archiving that we are sometimes still struggling with the more easy type of data, as in surveys and experiments. I was part of the National Academy of Science Committee in the US that tried to give some guidelines on how to deal with these new data types when it comes to creating transparency, this report might be also fruitful for the discussion here. In BERD, we hope at least to start this process here of creating a platform that allows this interaction between data scientists and domain specialists when creating analysis notebooks, when deciding on what algorithms should be used, and being able to document such initiatives. So in sum, I do think there's a lot of promise, but I do think we have some homework to do when it comes to archiving the algorithms in addition. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Maybe I can start. So you had in this example from the US, you had this big block documentation, which is obviously very important. I mean, how would you judge the effort of documentation compared to generating the primary data?
Well, it always takes at least 3 times as long as you think it will. You know, that would be my way of saying this is the ratio to the primary data collection. It's a little difficult because some of the primary data collections, I was involved in a large collection of over 100 million responses or surveys in the COVID context over 2 years, every day, random samples across the world. That was a big project. So relative to that, creating the documentation was short, but it still took 6 months, right? So it can be a lot of work, and the problem is, you know, so it might, there's a basic set of work it always takes, you know, no matter how small or large the data is, right? Because if you keep collecting the same data every day, then, you know, so I'm not sure if that's the right metric to think about that, but the point being, it is a lot of work. Right? And we heard that from the other speakers. And I forgot, someone started to ask the discussion of like, what's the incentive structure for people who do that kind of work to do that kind of work, right? And citations, maybe we've tried that for a long time, but I'm not sure that really worked, you know? And at the Institute for Employment Research, we had this debate for a long time. There's a group of people that works hard in creating these surveys and collecting the data, and then there are some high-flying economists who just write the papers with them and don't even care about the data, right? So anyway, there's a bit of a mismatch here in the recognition, and I think it's not as easy as to say, like, oh, you will get cited with the data. You know, there's a real shifting and thinking needed to get the incentive system right, and I'm not saying I have the answer, but I do think it gets increasingly important.
Okay.
Just a brief comment on what you last stated. I think one of the crucial problems we face with all this citation discussion and so on is we really need to acknowledge that there is a shift in how science is done. It's no longer the one and only scientist who does the work, but that's a collaborative or a team-based effort. And so it's a result of the division of labor between the different parts of that team, which is crucial. But our whole recognition system lags behind. It's not really already in the digital age in many ways.
I fully agree, and actually I believe we have folks from the DFG here, or at least listening, but I think there's another aspect to this. We don't even have positions for people that are very good at doing the data work. Right? I mean, there are people who like to do that, and some of it might not be scientific work in the sense of creating new knowledge, but they are the basis for new knowledge to be created, right? But it is not at all common for these large projects to then have positions for people for whom that is the profession. You know, I mean, there is the short-term contracting is often exactly opposed to, you know, gaining good knowledge and, you know, transmitting that over time on how these data are used and handled. And so I do think in addition to the rethinking of how we do science in terms of collaboratives, I think we have to rethink on what kind of positions we fund and in which kind of way for the data work specifically. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for highlighting crucial issues here. There is, to my mind, after working with different stakeholders for 5 years, I'm losing the distinction between data and metadata. And that's because oftentimes what one person is considering data can be often, describing other data, so it could be metadata for another person. And it sounds to me what is at the basis of your presentation is a call for increased annotation of data and kind of a more serious approach to documentation or to the metadata, provenance metadata around data creation.
Absolutely,
yeah.
That's a beautiful way to summarize it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I don't know if it's so much more of a comment then, but indeed there's this distinction between data and metadata, and we pay people sometimes with prestige and money to create data to increasingly higher levels of precision and data points, but the data curators probably also need that kind of recognition as well, because it's only through that cloud of metadata that you can interpret the numbers.
Exactly. Yeah. And you said it right. I mean, I do want to find this as it's the data generating process, right? And in at least in the context of the unstructured data and in the context that we work in BERD, there's this new element to it, which, the algorithm transforming. And so there's a set of analytic work that's not analytic work that created a certain paper, but that happened before, for which we haven't even started. I mean, we have started the discussion now, but for which there isn't much discussion on how to best create the metadata for that piece. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah, thank you. So your presentation in a way triggered a question in that when we use those apps or when we use those personal devices on us, we are not really getting the data either, right? Because then there are decisions by the company who manufactured my Garmin watch or who manufactured whatever I have, and they make assumptions about my heart rate, and and we know that some devices the heart rate changes depending on whether you run past trees or not. So it's in a way a little bit like the example of the picture you gave. And so how would you, since you are in that area where you're really trying to use those sensors that we put on people, and you're farming out, in a way, critical decisions about what kind of data are collected. And I've never seen that questioned. When you look at papers, nobody ever says, oh, we use that, but there are problems. We really don't know exactly what algorithm they put in to record the heart rate, for example, or something like that.
And only anecdotally do you see blog posts on what training data were used to train the devices for the step count, for the heart rate, what have you, right? And usually you see it after it breaks, right? So they didn't bring that example with me, but the facial recognition systems that are currently in place, they all have a bit of an issue properly detecting non-white females in the systems, right? Well, probably largely because there hasn't been enough training data. I mean, I don't know. I haven't trained these models, right? And I've looked at the training data, but that would be a not uncommon reason, or we could imagine that this is the case because if a lot of these trainings, a lot of the testing happens in the companies that create these algorithms and devices, and they certainly have a certain set of people working there that might not be the full representation. But you're right, it's not in there, and then you have the scientists downstream using these sensors, like we did in the Marienthal study, and then we rely on something that was already not well documented. So we wouldn't be able to document it in that way, but because we don't have the common understanding that it always has to be part of the documentation, eventually all of that gets lost, right? And sometimes we will notice, and other times we won't notice, and we will have false conclusions, and no way to detect it because the input is already broken, if you will. Yeah.
Okay, welcome back. Let's continue. So we have another talk or another presentation, which is done by two people, by Reinhold Kliegl and Alexander Schmiel. So Reinhold Kliegl is a professor emeritus of general psychology at the University of Potsdam. And his research has focused on the psychology of cognition. And he has also worked on mathematical modeling of cognition processes. And another topic of his research is something which affects all of us, the consequences of aging for cognition capacities. Well, now, Reinhold has also made a lot of contributions to open science. He is actually heading a research data management initiative of the Berlin-Brandenburg Akademie, which aims at implementing standards and more or less a scheme for digital data management and provision to a broader audience, also including the general public. Alexander Schmiel is the head of the IT department of BBAW, and he's responsible for what we call TELOTA. TELOTA stands for the electronic life of the Academy. And so he is in charge of running all the systems and managing research data of BBAW and making them accessible through web interfaces, but also through other channels. And they will talk on digital humanities from a BBAW perspective.
Well, thank you. So, and it was already mentioned, we have in the BBAW, we have that initiative, it's called an initiative on research data management, and we will really present our work on that research data management, which is basically an attempt to establish that as a workflow in the academy. And we also want to, and this initiative started in July 2020, right? So it's been running for 2 years, and we show you in a way how far we came. And we also would like to acknowledge Katja Masiniak. She was the research scientist in that initiative, and she contributed very much, and actually also to this presentation. So we translated some slides that she prepared earlier in the year. So all academy projects contain components of digital humanities, or DH, and some of them are pure DH projects. They cover all aspects of DH, such as digitization, data modeling, research software engineering, and of course research data management, probably abbreviated to RDM. They are supported by the DH department, and that is sort of that TELOTA group that was mentioned that is really taking care of that. So RDM is a core aspect of digital humanities, and I think it fits very nicely into the topic of today's workshop on open research data. So we are in the somewhat comfortable position that the initiative implements the Academy's mission statement on open science, and that there is actually also a licensing guideline. That is, we did not start from scratch, right? So mission statement and licensing guideline were motivated by the fact that in the Academy, actually, since the end of the 90s, the Academy has collected digital data from basic research in the humanities and has made them available to the research communities. And this past and ongoing research amounts really to the genuine treasure of the Academy. This is really incredible. This is incredible data we have here. But, of course, there are formidable challenges. And 3 of them relate, obviously, to the technological changes, to the exponential growth of data, and to the unusually long run times of our academy projects, which is very different from the rest of science, I would say. So here is the problem. Open science activities have to a large degree been carried out by project scientists who are obviously qualified in the subject matter of their research, but they are usually autodidacts with respect to data science. And I think it was mentioned before too. So technological changes and the sheer quantity of research data emerging in the humanities will make it necessary to curate them as a task in its own right, to be dealt with during the entire research process. And that is from planning until archiving of project activities. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, I guess. So we really need a new mental model for the scientific process. In most people's minds, RDM still is something you delegate, kind of like a secretarial job. That is not good. RDM is increasingly part of the core business of project managers and scientific staff in projects. So the images on this slide here, they illustrate the range of digital research data at the Academy. And they range from text and images to databases and research software to actually 3D objects. We were actually planning on having a hologram at one time to have a digital representation of our 3D objects. So digital research data is nothing new at the Academy. For example, the Jahresberichte für Deutsche Geschichte already appeared on a CD in the 1990s. The ancient Egyptian dictionary puts its digital text corpus slips in archive online. And there are sort of quite a few things related to the digital dictionary of the German language, or in the center of digital lexicography for the German language. So there are various activities, and they've all been going on for a long time and been very productive and contributed really to the reputation of the Academy. And since October last year, we also have that primary responsibility for one of those NFDI consortium. BERD was mentioned before, so here in the Academy it's Text Plus. The Central Working Group for Digital Humanities and Research Data Management is TELOTA. And TELOTA, that's just an acronym, it was mentioned before, has been supporting the digital concerns of the Academy projects since 2001. And together with them has also acquired digital projects and developed a number of digital resources. So TELOTA curates these projects as best as it can, even beyond the duration of the project runtimes. Now, in recent years, research data management has become a task, has become increasingly important and also more formal. For example, relating to funding guidelines, right? I mean, so you have to document that now. Therefore, research data management can no longer simply be done on the side by TELOTA or the projects themselves. And as already mentioned, actually, in the mission statement, research data management is an integral task in modern research. So the heterogeneity of the data is very large, and we've tried to illustrate that here again in blue. So we have complex digital resources, editions, collections, and dictionaries, and they are the result of the research process. And these resources get a significant added value by connecting and enriching them with data and metadata. And against this background, it is obvious that there is not one, but hundreds of definitions for research data. And each research field basically has its own. And in the initiative, we agreed on the definition on the slide. I'm not going to read it right now, but this definition has proven very viable for the heterogeneity of the Academy research data. So we are not claiming that that is suitable for everybody, but for our context, which is quite large, that was actually quite productive. So the focus of the initiative so far has been on the development of research data management guidelines for the Academy's research projects. Which file formats are suitable, what metadata will be collected. The claim is that the implementation of this goal leads to a facilitation of the work in the projects, and that there is then really a perceptible added value. We certainly do not want data management to be perceived or experienced as a new version of bureaucratic overload, which is the first thing you encounter when you come with that kind of questions. So to this end, we established the RDM initiative as the central point of contact with its own websites for all projects in the Academy. We implemented an instance of the Research Data Management Organizer for the creation of data management plans. That will become clearer when Alexander takes over. We created data management plans with all ongoing Academy projects. And finally, we carried out a self-evaluation of the research data practices with another instrument called RISE. So, of course, our activities do not take place in a vacuum, but are always embedded in the observation of external developments in the constantly evolving field of research data management. So let's take a closer look at these points listed here, and let's start with a look at the role of data and data management during the life cycle of research projects at the Academy. And with this, I hand off to Alexander Schmiel.
Thank you very much. I think I use. So yeah, let's first have a look at the services we already offer in the field of digital humanities and research data management to support scholars in the Academy's projects. On this slide, you can see the abstract sequence of a research project lifecycle divided into 4 phases, from the idea or the conceptual phase to the research phase, which usually is the longest phase, or in our case, a very long phase, to the project results and publication phase, and the last phase, the preservation and maintenance of availability of all project results, including research data, long after the end of the project. Now, added to this slide, you can see some bullet points of exemplary DH work packages, which are implemented by the DH experts from Telota and colleagues working directly in the Academy's projects. Those are mapped to the particular project phases. Many of these tasks can already be summarized under the term research data management, such as the development of a DH concept in which, among other things, the data formats to be used are defined and the selection of metadata standards or controlled vocabulary or more. And now, as a result of the Research Data Management Initiative, additional services are added to the different phases of the project lifecycle. And I want to emphasize that we do not want to add extra work to the research projects, but rather support them in the challenges of a well-thought-out RDM and the well-thought-out research data management. The initiative's RDM experts guide and help the projects in conceptualizing and writing new grant proposals, for example, or advise them on the selection of a suitable license for research data. In addition to individual RDM consulting we do for single projects, the initiative is also dedicated to developing good practice guidelines across projects. For example, in the form of a proposal for a folder structure to store data on group drives. That's very simple, but also very important, especially with a runtime from over 20 years. Or to add the RDM aspects in the check-in process for new employees. This also underlines the interfacing function of the Research Data Management Initiative between researchers and other organizational units, such as Telota and the IT services with regard to data backup or research software engineering, or the Academy Archive with regard to archiving the research data, or the Academy Library in cooperation for the publication of research data, for which we now prepared the eDocs server of the Academy, which will be able from this Wednesday on, so the day after tomorrow, to store and register research data alongside publications. This kind of new services, like the new options using the eDocs server, must be regularly communicated to our colleagues in the research projects. For this purpose, we conduct training and information events. With that, a look at the role of the data management plan the data management plan, short, the DMP. The DMP is the key instrument and central documentation tool in our research data management. Ideally, the DMP comprehensively describes the handling of research data in a project and accompanies the project's entire research lifecycle. The DMP is basically like a written, guideline-based interview, which is documented using the web-based software of the Research Data Management Organizer, or RDMO. RDMO allows us to work together with the colleagues in the projects on a DMP. Through RDMO, a questionnaire can be opened via the web browser, and new information can be added, and information can be viewed and searched in. Very important, the information is not public. A DMP is an internal document, unless, of course, a project decides to publish its DMP and make it accessible for others. Data management plans are more and more mandatory as funding agencies increasingly require them with grant proposals. However, they are more than that. The DMP is primarily intended to serve the researchers. For example, solutions to questions such as which research data can be made available when, where, in which form, according to which requirements, and which steps have to be taken to do this, do not have to be found under time pressure at the end of the project, but rather can be considered early and in cooperation. In addition to all this, a DMP serves as part of a formal project documentation which is continuously extended. A DMP is to be understood as a living document, which is particularly important in view of the long durations of research projects at the Academy. You know, in 12 to 25 years, there usually is a lot of technological development, which has implications on research data management. Changes have to be evaluated and, if needed, to be integrated. So we encourage our projects to review the plan at least once a year and, if necessary, to update it together with us. In doing so, one can also reflect critically on oneself and check on the questions like, do I actually still adhere to the once established rules of file storage or file naming? Or did I generate additional research data in the course of the project that were not primarily goal of my work, but which could be now valuable for other researchers and that I can publish now, or other questions? For the Academy as an institution, we are also pursuing the goal of ensuring that all reusable research data are archived and, if possible, made available to the public under an open license. This way, we increase the visibility of the Academy's research and support the implementation of the goal of open science to which the Academy has committed itself with its mission statement. One of the tasks of the initiative was to take stock of where the Academy stands in terms of institutional research data management. To do this, we evaluated ourselves with the help of the RISE-DE framework. RISE stands for Research Infrastructure Self-Evaluation Framework and provides a reference model for strategy processes for institutional research data management and a framework for self-evaluation. RISE is divided into 9 categories that cover all research data management aspects. Of these 9 categories, the first 8 are further subdivided into 25 topics, such as strategic aims, technical investment, personal investment, training, data security, cost structures, and so on. As an institution, one works through all of the topics, defines a target status to be achieved, and reviews the current status in this topic. We did this for the Academy and came to the conclusion that we are relatively well positioned in 8 areas, which is about a third of all the 25 topics, where the current status corresponds to the target status. However, this does not mean that nothing more needs to be done in these areas. Here we have achieved the required status, which we now must actively maintain. And of course, we have to work step by step on achieving the desired status in the other topics. As said before, cooperation and networking is a crucial part of research data management work. The Academy works actively together in the field of RDM with the other German science academies and also with other national and international partners. For example, we are involved in various NFDI consortia. In particular, the Academy plays a central role in the NFDI consortium Text Plus, where we are not only actively involved in all 3 data domains, digital collections, lexical resources, and digital scholarly editions. I actually think the Academy is the only institution that is involved in all 3 data domains. The Academy is also one of the 5 co-applicant institutions and, represented by the Zentrum Sprache, the Center for Language, it is responsible for the coordination of the data domain lexical resources. TELOTA and the Research Data Management Initiative are working in the data domain for digital scholarly editions, where we are involved in the implementation of various research data measures, including standardization. Because research data management is so central within the academy and it is becoming increasingly relevant as a topic, both nationally and internationally, we decided to give it a more central role inside TELOTA. In addition to the pillars of IT and digital humanities, we established a third pillar in which the permanent tasks related to RDM are bundled. These are all tasks that TELOTA has already taken on for the past 20 years, but that are now being spun off from the DH area in order to do justice to their relevance. This pillar then takes over the classic task of a data center, including, for example, running the eDoc server on the Academy, which also serves as the central publication directory service for research data generated in the Academy. And now, Reinhard Kliegel would like to close with a few remarks.
Yeah, so research data management is comprehensive, multifaceted, and complex. It can only be done in a team and in cooperation across disciplines. If we implement it correctly, it leads to an important component of good scientific practice, being implemented almost automatically. The keyword here is, of course, reproducibility of research results. That's a big concern and will be growing, I'm quite sure. So I would like to underline once more the points about resources, investments, and common research data policy. We must not delegate the conceptual aspects of research data management to any subordinate or ancillary body, but we must understand them as defining features of the research process. If we succeed in this, then I think we will live up to the claim of the mission statement that this academy will become an open academy in the flourishing open science landscape. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this nice summary of the activities of the Academy. Are there questions?
Yes, thank you both very, very much. I have a specific question, but I have a more general idea about what your answer could aim at. The specific question is, when you talk about the dynamic research management plans, this means that, for instance, for file names, you have some restrictions, and these restrictions change, or might change. Is this part of the metadata of the data that has been produced at a certain time? And to come to the more general thing, when you have a kind of a policy that might have influence on the data, on the structure of the data, on the essentially on the quality of the data, is this policy also maintained as part of the ecosystem?
Well, that is quite a complex question, as it's, yeah. Well, the first thing is the data management plan documents everything we restrict ourselves or our projects to. And it is also preserved along the whole project runtime, and it is published with the data or stored with the data. It's not publicly published. So we always know what decisions we made, why we made them, and we adjust, of course, during the project runtime when there are new standards appear, but there will never be new standards or not so quick new standards in naming files. We use the system with the 8-bit ASCII code, and we should be fine. No special signs in there, then, yeah. But of course, folder structures, it's very important, that can change. Or the data models or the data formats of the data itself can change. Restricting the projects to a certain data model is something that has a lot of downsides, but also a lot of benefits. And this is something I think all the NFDI consortia have to deal with to achieve what they want to do. We have to find a way to reduce complexity, to make data usable and maintainable, and to deal with data in the future. Anyways, we cannot do the full complexity, or we cannot put the full complexity of what we should put into the data because of the research question we want to ask. But for the maintenance or for the publishing data, we have to do it in a more convenient way for researchers who want to reuse the data. That all must be documented. That is the important point. And then I think you can follow and see this out.
Okay, other questions? Maybe you can make a comment on to what extent this activity is related to activities of other academies in Germany, and if there is some coordination or something like this.
Between the academies, there is like a roof organization, the Union of the Science Academies in Germany, and they have a working group, the AG Humanities, and in this AG Humanities, everything is, yeah, we talk to each other, we work to each other. There is a meeting in the end of this week where we talk about research data management, publishing data, our work in the different NFDI consortia. So everything we do is coordinated, and we try to find synergies as much as possible, which is often the case. Yeah.
And they actually were part of the initiative. So we had external members, and some of them came from external organizations like that and participated, and they were useful. You know, they have their own views of that in different academies, and so that enriched the discourse here as well, I would say.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions at the moment, then I'd like to suggest that we start our panel discussion. Okay, thank you. So let me briefly introduce the panel before we start. So there's Franziska Böhm. She is the Vice President of Intellectual Property Rights at the FIZ Karlsruhe. This is the Leibniz Institute for Information Infrastructure. And she is the Professor for Intellectual Property Rights at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, the KIT. And she's an expert for legal issues related to open science. Then there is Ralf Ludwig. Ralf Ludwig is a professor for physical and theoretical chemistry at the University of Rostock, and his research focuses on molecular interactions in a broad range of systems. I don't have the time to explain in detail. He is here as a member of the Senate of the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and in that role he deals with open data and open issues of open science from the viewpoint of a funding organization. Matthias Schäffler, you know already from his talk. And finally, there is Andreas Witt. He heads the Department of Digital Linguistics at the Leibniz Institute for the German Language in Mannheim, and is a professor for computational humanities and text technology at the University of Mannheim. He also serves as a speaker of Text Plus, one of the major NFDI consortia in the humanities you have heard about during this afternoon several times. Okay, so let's start with something maybe general. We have heard many different aspects of open science, and we have also seen that there is a lot of effort required, starting with the effort of the scientists, but also effort from an organizational point of view. There are big resources required, technological resources, but also others. And so at some point when you talk to people who may be a bit skeptical about the whole endeavor, they may ask you, what are the major benefits of that? I mean, what will improve compared to the present way in which we do science by embarking on all these different strategies we have heard about? Here are microphones if you want, so who wants to start?
Yes,
Please.
Yes, thank you. There are several advantages, several benefits. First of all, I think the research, open research leads to reproducible results, and open research helps the making the research more understandable in a way. This is one of the points, but I see also some kind of a minor aspect that is not given that often. When we make research data available publicly, even ideally open, then they can be reused from researchers that do not have the possibilities to deal with these, to produce their data on their own, because it is also a cost-intensive approach. So institutions that are, in a way, not as rich as other institutions, or even citizen scientists, have the chance to deal with research data in a way they would like to do this. This are the, in a way, benefits. I also see some downsides, but we can talk about these things later.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe two points I like to mention from maybe rather legal point of view. I think that we don't question that open research is very important, and there are a lot of it opens various research possibilities. Two things I think which can benefit, or which are benefits of that, is when we use new technologies and develop new technologies, in particular in the EU with regard to research, all these AI systems, but also the repositories which need the software. What I see is that now we require all these legal concepts like privacy by design or by default already. We try to develop it already within the technology. So this is something new. All the technologies which are developed to support research, they are now developed with a kind of legal thinking behind. And I think this is really important when it comes to AI readiness, as you told us in the second presentation. So we don't have to let's say, assess that in the aftermath. We can already implement it in the technology, so it fosters or it leads to more legally thought through technologies. That's the first point. And the second point relates to concepts such as accountability and also transparency, which are also concepts in the fair data or fair research movement. And these are also legal concepts, and these concepts are, I think, assured in this open research framework. I think the EU enacted a lot of data sharing laws recently, so the EU tries to make these concepts more present in the data sharing context. And I'm asking myself, but I think it will help a bit, how to transpose these accountability and transparency concepts or fair principles into industry, because these data acts will require industry to share data, also their research data. And I think this will be a benefit if industry is a bit forced to share more data. This is maybe the second benefit it will have. I don't know whether these EU acts will have the wished result, but at least we will have a lot of data acts which will force industry to share research data, and research can profit from that.
Okay.
Yeah, so of course I share all the things which have been said so far. So an additional thing may be that we can foster trans and interdisciplinary work. So this is what I like to see very much. But of course there are similar problems or even additional problems compared to what we are discussing here. To put everything into a broader perspective, so we also have to show that we have an economic value and in particular some advantages and an impact on society as well. And if I discuss to people outside the scientific community, and if they hear that we will spend so much money, right, on establishing this research data management, you should have some additional arguments they can follow, right? And what I usually saying then, think about or imagine if we would have had a really good research data management already some time ago along the FAIR principles. Maybe during the pandemic we could better handle the pandemic. Maybe we could have developed the vaccines even earlier than we did already. And in terms of thinking about energy and the problems we have now, to save energy and to get rid of the fossil fuels, for example, maybe if there would be a better data management before, we could handle this problem a lot easier, right? We would have had a better infrastructure, better know how to transport, how to store, how to save energy. And a final example is usually what I mention is climate change. Of course, it's a big topic, right? But also there, a good data management, research data management is required, in particular to develop new technologies, right? It was mentioned already before this afternoon. So a good research data management is of tremendous importance, for example, for scientists and societies in so-called underdeveloped countries, right? So to me, it's a really very important aspect, so that they don't have to do the same errors, right, as we did, and that they can make use from our experience and from our data finally. So I think it's really important to bring these things into a broader perspective so that regular people, right, understand how important a good research data management is for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with what was said. I still see that many people, of course, the people who are here agree with that, but you also have to see that many people still, in fact, are not really joining, right? And I think we still have to work, and I think there's no question that scientific studies should be reproducible. That is good scientific practice. Still, that is not fulfilled in many cases. And that is not fulfilled, for example, in crystal growth. It's extremely complicated to describe really what are the details which are important. And I always say, actually, someone who grows a crystal is like a Michelin star cook. I mean, it's not really just that you say, actually, what are the ingredients. It's really something else, which, and putting this really into hard information is not so easy. And I think what we have to achieve is, yes, reproducibility, but we also have to achieve that the individual researcher understands that is good for him or for her. And I think there we still have to work and to really make sure sharing will immediately also actually help you. I mean, there is this very naive thing, and not naive, very simple thing from George Bernard Shaw, right? If I have an apple and you have an apple and we exchange the apples, we still have one apple. But if I have an idea and you have an idea, and if we exchange the ideas, we both have two ideas. And that is the same with data. And really seeing the possibilities, if we all share data, and in this computational material science we see this already, then you can do completely new methods which you would not dream of yet, and you would get new insights. And that, in fact, is what the individual researcher actually can then use. I really think we have to be very careful that we are not getting separated from the people who are actually doing the work, and that we still accept that it's a lot of work to really bring reproducibility and not just publishing data, but publishing well-characterized data. If you just publish data that is of no value, you need really to describe. That is a lot of work, and we have to really we have to accept that this is actually good scientific work.
Okay, so there are several points which I think we should discuss a little bit more about. I mean, the first question is, when you compare the traditional way of doing research, traditional research strategies, and try to develop it towards data-centric strategies, what you, Matthias, discussed in your talk quite a bit. I mean, so the first question is, what will change in the scientific practice by that? And second, how do we train people to be able to do this? This is non-trivial, because I mean, it requires a different type of kind of approach, of kind of training maybe. So what are your thoughts about that?
I'm happy to start again. So for the training, especially in the fields like the humanities, where I'm from, it is quite important to have this kind of digital literacy and training right from the start. So if somebody studies, for instance, linguistics or German studies, people do not think about the necessity of using computers in these things. This is one thing we have to rethink even our educational system in a way, because we will all need this. But for things related to the change of tradition, I really liked this fourth dimension in Matthias' talk. We come to quite a new paradigm in all research areas, that we look at automatically found correlations. Usually research deals with hypotheses, and hypotheses are in a way proven or at least confirmed somehow by well-chosen data, experiments, and all these things. But if we look at correlations, then we can come up with new hypotheses. I think this is one of the very interesting new developments, only possible when using large amounts of data and, of course, the algorithms.
Yeah, I think for people who are going for the PhD already, right, so they know how important science and research is, and how important research data are, and possible research data management. And I think they are relatively easy to get right on such a project. But all the others below, they are not really confronted with research before, right? So I was always thinking, I mean, I'm also a member of this expert commission, right, deciding about all these NFDI initiatives on consortia. So we were thinking about the aspect you already mentioned, right, that it should be research data management, should be some part of education already, right, or maybe introduced into curricula, implemented in curricula. I still believe that, but it will be, it requires really strong efforts, right, to get that done, and to convince people, beside all the other things we have to teach already, right, to implement this data management or treating data into education and into teaching. But I think it's really needed, because it has to be as early as possible, so then it's easier to be done, and more people are used to do it, right? Because some of the problems we still are facing, and I think all the NFDI consortia are facing, that there are only a few people, right, really know how to deal, as we heard before, right? How to deal or how to set up a good research data management, and are familiar with all the things which are needed and required to do a good job.
Yeah, I mean, I think changing the curricula is really necessary, I think, and to some extent people agree, but it has not been done yet, and I think this is what really should be forced. I feel the students actually are even waiting for that. I mean, they see that the students already see that this is the way to go, right? They also actually all would love to learn more really in their specific fields about statistical learning and artificial intelligence. And so I think the universities have basically to do what you said, and what I think is what the students already want to do.
They are a little bit less old-fashioned than we are sometimes.
I'd just like to add something from the experience in the NFDI consortia we got with this legal training and things why you should share data. And there's something we are always encountered with, is the question, the researchers think there are a lot of legal hurdles to share data. And these are often misunderstandings. And we often fight against these misunderstandings and say, no, you can share data. You are not restricted by data protection law or by IP law to share the data. And these misunderstandings need to be a bit, let's say, overcome, and we need to have more trainings for researchers also to understand, or to make understandable that they can share the data, and there are no legal hurdles to do that often. And this is the experience from the last 3 years, I would say, and it helps always to talk to them and to explain to them that they are not there actually, these hurdles.
Okay, so I mean, this brings us to the role of the individual scientist in the business. And I mean, when you talk to your grad students, she or he will tell you, look, I'm already so overburdened with my research, what I have to do, and so there is not any capacity that I can reserve time for making data available for other people. I have a hard time to manage my project even without that. And the second point is, from a more general perspective, that the academic career system is not really offering a benefit for providing data in a transmittable form or in a form in which they can go into data repositories. This is considered some minor side activity. It's typically not honored. And also when you look how we make careers of scientists, I mean, we look at their publications. We may look if you are a strong believer in bibliometry. I'm not, but I mean, this is an industry these days. You count citations, you calculate age indices, and for all that, open research data is kind of totally irrelevant. So this means to convince a young person to embark on this requires probably to also give a certain weight of such activities in the way in which we promote people and in which we kind of help them to define their academic careers. And so what is your impression about this? Or maybe you have even practical experience with that.
I mean, I would say what you described is the situation. But I also would say, when you say the academic career system is such and such, it is determined by people like you and me.
I agree.
and that means, in fact, I mean, we are sitting in these committees which decide actually who gets this job or not. And I think if we start talking the way we talk today, and I think we believe what should be done, I think we should get more people who evaluate things not according to an age factor and not according to citation. I mean, at the end, I think also good data should be cited. Right? I mean, that should be also a citation. And as I said, Brahe is actually honored. I mean, he has done the best job at that time. So you should also really give reference there. But at the end, who should get a job should be the one who get the best, is creating the best data, in addition to the one who is doing good interpretation as well. But I think this has equal weight. And I think this is really that we change our committees where we are sitting.
Yes, but this is maybe still a long way, especially in some areas. Maybe the hard sciences are a little bit more ahead than the humanities. But till then, I think it is also necessary to not only convince the individual researchers, but to have some kind of guidelines or even restrictions from the funding agencies. So the funders or the institutions have to be aware that they need some kind of extra time for making this possible, and people should be, in a way, highly encouraged to build data according to these new principles. It's like a kind of a research policy that everybody has to adhere to.
Can I just add, if you wouldn't follow that and a PhD student leaves your group, you would not be able to deal with his data or her data, even yourself anymore. Yes. So I think it's really in your intrinsic own interest that this is done.
Yes.
Right? And the sharing, in addition, should be no additional work. We should make that really very simple.
Yes, but this comes also with a downside the institutions have to be aware of. This means they need to invest not only time, but indirectly or directly money into the system. And this is money that is not available, given the fact that we will not increase the money extremely. This is money that is not available for the, say, fundamental research in a way. So this is some decisions institutions have to take at some point.
Yeah, I think that's definitely our job, right? I mean, I have to deal with things in my own lab, right? If I don't establish research data management in my own lab, I cannot expect that, that my university will do that. I cannot expect that all the NFDI consortia do it in a similar way. So it all depends upon us. Also, how we, what kind of criteria we have in the committees to hire somebody, right? We all know that, and everybody is complaining about that publications and money they bring in and age indices are that important. But we are the guys who can change this situation, right? And also how universities go along with the research data management. That's usually the argument you hear. As you mentioned, we don't have money for that. We don't have any kind of infrastructure for that. And I think it's our job to establish that and to help that it will be established. So in my case, at our university, I try to get the people together, let's say for an NFDI for CAT, because they are nicely represented at LICAT and the university in Rostock. And there are two collaborative research centers which get additional money, right, for establishing research data management in their own in their own center. But I think it's a good idea to make use of it for the whole university, right? So that we grab all these three partners, and they should tell us, and they should help to establish a research data management at my university, which may be lacking of money and infrastructure so far.
Maybe a last point, maybe minor, but I think important in the work contracts of the researchers. And we often have clauses on who belongs to the data, or how the data sharing should be organized. And these clauses vary very much from universities to other research institutes. So we don't have any guidelines on how to deal with these data ownership in the work contracts, and we sometimes looked at these work contracts and established that there are so many differences in the work contracts regarding this data ownership, and I think a lot of research institutions, but also universities, would profit from kind of guidelines how to deal with data ownership in work contracts. And this is sometimes important, or it is important for researchers to have a clear rule on that, and so that they don't have to ask every time when they do something to whom the data actually belongs.
Okay, this is an important point in my view, and we will come back to the legal aspects in a minute. But before we do that, do you think that we need a new type of scientists, which you may call data scientists, who really takes care of this provision of data, analysis of data? I mean, in physics, we typically distinguish between experimentalists and theoreticians, but I mean, both of them are not real experts in what we are talking about. And I mean, to a certain extent, also to convince people, I mean, probably one needs a third category which takes care of that. In my view, this also offers the opportunity for linking different disciplines, because it's clear if everyone embarks on digital, I mean, there are, for example, links between humanities and computer science, and also we have heard from Frauke Kreuter how important software aspects are. So, I mean, this is something which is not in the system yet, but what do you think about it? It's also a question to you as kind of the representative of DFG. I mean, how realistic is it to get such positions through proposals submitted to a funding agency?
Yeah, you addressed me directly. So, yes, I mean, I think DFG and this expert commission was aware of these problems, right? As I mentioned before, that there are no data scientists and not the type of scientists around, right, which will help to establish the research data management. But this is why this is what the funding is partially for, right? To establish these positions, right? To win and recruit people like that. And so this position and this work should be very valuable for the people, right? And there should be some benefits. So there should be a possibility of a scientific career in this field, like in all the others too, right? As a single different scientific career from all the others. So beside chemistry, physics, or what humanities, or whatever you can think about. And there is also funding for that. So it's the NFDI consortia. That's not the only. That's not the only funding provided by DFG in this field. I would like to mention that some of the consortia, some of the proposals who haven't made it, right, were transferred to some of the smaller programs, right, to start with their ideas and to become a consortia later on. So there are a lot of other funding possibilities beside, right, strongly supporting this research data management and to educate people in this respect. Right?
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think we need these new profiles, but I also think that we are not there yet, because I have difficulties to imagine a profile, for instance, in my field, computational linguistics, digital humanities, for a data scientist, that profile who is also able to be a data scientist in life sciences or in physics or in whatever research area. So if we have a kind of a profile for a data scientist, we have to find a way to define this profile in a very general way to avoid people asking for, you know, you also have to be a linguist and you also have to be a philologist. And so we have to, in a way, build some areas, some basic knowledge from statistics, mathematics, software development and all these things. And this profile should be applicable to several fields. And I think this is a long way we have to go.
I think there are already initiatives which develop curricula for data scientists, and they are already in place. And I also see more and more proposals coming up with positions, like data scientists, to support a specific research field. Maybe it's difficult. I would disagree when I say it's just one profile. Yeah, there are different profiles depending on the research field, and this maybe makes it so difficult to describe in a proposal. Yeah, yeah, that's everything.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I have a little bit. I hesitate a little bit in defining a profile too narrow. I mean, science is done by people, and if you find actually a genius person, you should. If he's a data scientist, you should take this person, and this person will develop the field and not we. I think we should not really make a profile too narrow. And the same thing, we should not, if you have an opening as a professor, making it too narrow what theory this person should do or what experiment. Mm-hmm. I think data scientists should be treated in the same way as scientists and as people who will bring in and will really bring the field ahead. And so let's see what they can do and be open and get the best people.
Okay, good.
I would like to give a brief example. Good that you said that. So I have a PhD student, right? It took him a while to finish his studies. So he passed in his dissertation, I think, last week. But he's working already in research data management, right? At another university. And he has much more fun to do that than he had ever fun to this work in my lab. What I want to say is sometimes you have no idea about that people have really a nice fable for this kind of work. Of course, he was a good scientist too. And here what Matthias Schäffler said becomes right. You have to deal a little bit with the subject, right? And you need to know what you are doing, and you need to know what the requirements are. And if you find somebody in your lab or in your environment who has a little bit fable for data management and for computers and things like that and models, then grab this person or let him fly, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So let me come back to these legal aspects related to open research data. I mean, there are obviously issues with intellectual property rights. There's also among scientists often the concern that when they make their data open, they kind of lose priority. And priority is a very important aspect of kind of assessing the scientific performance of people, in particular in the sciences. So when in physics it's always important to be the first, and how do you reconcile this with more or less making data openly available? And as Eric said in his talk, I mean, you lose control over what's happening with the data. And I mean, what are kind of legal provisions to keep intellectual property rights, and maybe also to avoid damage created by providing open data?
Yeah, maybe I answer then first. So I think there are two really major legal aspects when it comes to data sharing, and the first one is IP right or copyright, and the second one is data protection. If we share data, it depends whether the data are personal data or not. And if we have personal data, it becomes much, much more difficult. And we have this, let's say, models or different access models, like visiting centers you described in the first presentation. And we see some kind of models already working. And the EU also enacted a lot of laws saying relating to this data sharing, and also on data sharing of data which are not personal data. So the EU has a huge data strategy, and there's the Data Act, the Data Governance Act. There is a regulation on AI which will come, which also relates to a lot of data sharing. So we see a lot of acts which might lead to more legal certainty when it comes to data sharing in the sense of personal and non-personal data. And we see a lot of more industry involvement, or industry will be forced to share these data. When we go back to copyright, copyright is maybe more regional, more local than all these big data sharing initiatives. And I would say, or come back to what I said before, in this field, it is particularly important that we explain how far copyright goes, which data are copyright protected, because when I see the experience we have in, let's say, consortia with data like chemistry data or also material data, they are often not protected by copyright, but researchers think they are protected by copyright, and then they put a license on it, although they are not protected actually legally. And that's a huge thing. So then we come and explain to them, oh no, it's actually not protected, so why do you put a license on it? And this can have effects we don't want to have. So a lot of training and explanations are required also to explain why, when copyright does not apply, because in a lot of cases copyright does not apply to a lot of raw data, but a lot of researchers have a lot of misunderstanding.
But directly to this, I mean, to what extent can you translate the experience from open access publishing to open data? I mean, is this a straight way, or do you need, from a legal point of view, new things?
Yeah, maybe you relate to data licenses. Yeah. It's a huge topic. There are a lot of people asking for this. I'm not that sure whether more licenses will help more, or whether we should rather discuss different concepts, because data are not always copyright protected. So I'm not a big fan of data licenses, but I see where the question comes from.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Maybe as an example, quite often medical data is mentioned as a kind of a showstopper for open data, and I'm very thankful that you gave these ideas, present the ideas of putting the computation to the data, where this helps. In my field, in linguistics, my home institution, the Leibniz Institute for the German Language, does have the task to do research on German as it is currently spoken and written in Germany. And almost all of our empirical base is copyright protected. All the journal articles, all the newspaper articles, all the books, almost everything. And therefore we have to find ways to deal with this data in a fair way, although we are aware that this is not open in the strict sense of open and free and exchangeable. But this is possible, thankfully.
I'm a little bit more optimistic. I mean, of course, if there are medical data or personal data, there's no question that you have to be very careful. I mean, because whatever you do will be misused for someone. I mean, there's always a dual use that you cannot really fully avoid. In the field which I'm representing, which I would say is basic fundamental research, I think, coming to this example, open access. Of course, you're never sure if people who read something in open access will really cite you. But I think you can be sure that the important people will do that. I mean, if people are relevant, they will not really cheat and try actually to, because that will hurt them at the end. If someone who's not important does that, who cares, I would say. So I would say, so in our case, in this NOMAD thing, where we have billions of data now, we have open access and some, I mean, basically, we don't register, we don't look who's actually getting the data. There's no checking, you don't have to register. You only basically, when you take data, implicitly you accept the CC BY license. And that means, of course, you are suggested to cite, but maybe you don't. But I can tell you that again, the important people would cite you. And only that, I think, counts. And maybe just to say something against you, Thomas, in our field, you always want to be the first. I think actually in my group, I think you want to be the best. If you are also the first, then it's fine. But more important is to be the best.
Can I just say that you refer to such an important point, which is research ethics, yeah? And which is not legally, luckily, not legally regulated. And I think this is even more important than any legal rules, to have a kind of research ethic and to adhere to this research ethic and not to regulate everything in detail.
Yeah, and I don't think that this can be really fully regulated, right? So you have no chance to do that, and I think maybe it's a good way not to do it. So what Matthias Scheffler said is certainly right? But I think if you are a big shot, you will be certainly cited, right? If you are an unknown researcher, it may be somewhat more difficult because nobody will notice that you ever did this work, right? I mean, or it can be. So it's really important if work is published, wherever it's coming from, whoever the author is, that there will be sufficient credit for that, and that it will be known by others as well.
Okay, thank you. So, so far we have actually mainly talked about concepts and the development of concepts in the different areas, in the different disciplines and so on. But at the end of the day, we really need infrastructure, and we need big infrastructure for many, many terabytes of data. I mean, just to give you an example from physics, in physics there is a clear trend towards big machines, for example, X-ray research with 3 electron lasers. And this generates a totally unseen demand for storage capacities for data. And in particular, as these machines produce tons of data, there is an intense discussion, for example, about data reduction, where you reduce already the amount of data in the process of generating them, because otherwise you will never be able to manage this. And I think it's in other disciplines, it's pretty similar. And I mean, now comes the question at the end of the day, who is going to implement this infrastructure? what is the type of infrastructure? Are we talking about something which is kind of centralized, where, let's say in Germany, the BMBF or the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft provides huge data centers in which everyone deposits his or her data? Or are we talking about decentralized things, which may be on a local level, which may be locally easier to manage, but the question then is, what about reliability? What about technical standards? And at the end of the day, it's clear that we are talking over a multi-billion investment which is needed here. And on top now we have this energy discussion, and I mean, we all know that IT does not so fine with respect to energy. And so this is a new aspect. So, I mean, when I look at the electricity prices in Germany at the moment, this is a big hurdle for implementing huge data centers. And so the question is more or less, what would be realistic concepts to get this done at the end?
So I think if you look at the ERICS, the European Research Infrastructure Consortia, today most of these groups work decentralized. And I think for some areas you still have centralized approaches. I think CERN does do quite centralized way, and it's a specific field, and it's probably not different. It can't be done differently in certain fields, but essentially in almost other fields it is really necessary to do it decentralized because cost sharing. So if I deposit large amounts of data to somebody has to pay it, yeah? And if I keep it in my institution takes responsibility of these things. And maybe also legal aspects, so not every data set is allowed to move around. But as you mentioned, Thomas, we have to make quality standards. We have to make sure that a decentralized infrastructure does support certain standards of an infrastructure, for instance, availability of the data in 10 years from now, or even infinity, ideally, yes, as long as this institution exists, yes, and all these things.
Yeah. I think some of the data are so big, there is no way, in fact, even though we have the internet, but in fact, this amount of data you cannot really send via the internet. In fact, even in Nomad, in some data things, we put them on a hard disk and send them by post, which is faster than the internet. So at the moment, I think it does not make sense really to do everything centralized. The big data should be centralized, but it should be coordinated, and I think the metadata should be actually centralized. So there should be, and we are all working on this, and we're working on it not only in Germany, but actually it has to be an international activity. Metadata should be centralized and should be agreed on. Maybe there are different metadata, and then there is actually a dictionary which transforms, but that's fine. But they have to be centralized. The data most likely should be really local. Of course, if people don't have the potential, if the data are not so big, we should offer that they can be also centralized to make it just to help smaller universities, for example. But otherwise, I would say decentralized with metadata centralized.
Yeah, I think there are some legal requirements, as you already said. I mean, you can't have everything centralized if you have sensitive medical data. It's not a good idea to have a big server of that. I think everyone understands. Otherwise, I think we need to invest also in these techniques, although we are already doing it, but a bit more. Yeah, there are a lot of techniques, anonymization, pseudonymization, encryption. Everything needs to be applied to a certain research area, or use of synthetic data instead of real data. So there are these techniques, and which needs to be developed a bit more in particular research fields, and then maybe adapted to this centralized, decentralized question. Yeah, and maybe really, I wouldn't sometimes even say that always decentralized solutions are the best. Sometimes centralized solutions with a high technical protection are also quite a good idea, but it is also more open to attacks maybe if you have a centralized infrastructure. But we also discuss these concepts like data intermediaries in the political area, and I think these can be also concepts which need to be a bit elaborated a bit more in future and can serve as research data repositories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it's a good idea also to look to other consortia of the NFDI, right? Because all the consortia have their specialities, from whatever disciplines they are coming from. I remember only we have now one consortium. They started as two, right? The guys from astrophysics, astronomy, and particle physics, right? These are the big data guys, right? They really have to think about data reductions and things like that. So what I only want to say is that it makes sense to look to some other consortia, right? Because they have some specialties where we can learn from. At the beginning of this NFDI process, it was clear that there is no money for the hardware, right? Because if that would have been accepted, we were out of money already a week after we started, right? So this has to be provided by others, by the universities, by the institutes, and I think it's a good idea. Of course, we have a difficult situation now, and there's no further money available, and there are cuts instead. But you know, all these NFDI initiative is paid by the federal and the state level, right? And the ratio is like usual, 90 to 10%. I think we should talk to our state levels, right? In collaboration with the universities, that they provide money also for the hardware, that the universities and the institutions can establish research data management. Right. I don't think that we can expect more money from the federal level for that. My impression sometimes is that the governments at the state level are happy that everything is done by the federal level, right, including the funding in particular. So I think it's up to us to take them into responsibility for that.
Just one word, and I think we didn't discuss it as much as we should. Incentives for to finance this are so important, and we never discussed this incentive question. Yeah, when it now comes to these data intermediaries, everyone is saying, "Oh, we need it," but no one is asking which kind of incentives actually institutions have to implement that. And as long as we didn't solve the incentive question, we will not solve this question.
Yeah, this brings me to a point that I wanted to address anyway, namely, should this infrastructure be established only in public institutions, or is there room for something like public-private partnership? I mean, when you talk to the Googles of this world, they have a lot of tools and a lot of technology they could offer for that, and which is well advanced and which is in many cases ahead of what's available in the public sector. Yeah? On the other hand, when you talk to scientists about the idea that they should store their data in a cloud by Google or IBM or whatever, they think you are crazy, yeah? Because this is generates even more the feeling that you totally lose control over the evaluation of the data. I mean, is this, for this reason, totally unrealistic, or what do you think?
I think this is a very important question currently dealt with in several areas, for instance also in the NFDI. There are several sections. Franziska co-chairs one of the sections on legal issues, but there is currently a discussion on building up a new section on the collaboration with the research area and the industry. BERD, we heard about BERD just a minute ago or just an hour ago, takes in a way the lead in this activity, because they are convinced that more and more data comes from industry, and we should find a way to make this data also available for research. But we are in a extremely difficult situation because the industry would like to keep the data and get our data, and we would like to, yes, and they do not want to share the data in general. But if they see benefits, then maybe the situation changes. But I think we can't survive without this data treasure, or at least we could survive, yes, but we cannot continue in a most appropriate way without these treasures. For instance, let alone the development of AI, machine learning, the success came from industry at the moment, and this is something we have to deal with. So we have to see, we have to acknowledge.
Yeah, so I have a short story for you in this respect, right? When we had this NFDI evaluation procedure, the people from astrophysics, astronomy, and elementary particle physics were telling us we don't need that, right? So we have Google. So Google is asking for our data to test their algorithms, right? And that really took place. But sometime later on, when they were still sending their data, they had to pay for it. Right? It's that simple. It's all about money. Mm-hmm. And this is why you should really discuss it in detail and be careful in this respect.
I mean, there is the political idea to force industry to share their data. This is the Forschungsdatengesetz, which is currently discussed on different political levels. And I think industry already said that they are not willing to share their data. This is the polite way of saying what they said. So they don't want to share their data. This is one side. They might be forced by law to do that in a couple of months even. So we will see how this comes out. But I'm really against this kind of, here's the industry and here is research and we don't work together. I think there are a lot of initiatives which are trying to bring a kind of compromise in that regard. So I'm also involved in this fair data project, and fair data space project, and there we try to find a way to bring industry data and research data together and then make better data out of that. And it might go more in this direction and not one against the other, because I think research can profit from industry and research, and industry can also profit from research. And they are doing it. I mean, this is something we know. It's just the other way around. We need to guarantee as well.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking with people from Google and with Amazon and the others in a very open way. And in fact, the first sentence which Google tells us is, you have to, what Ralf Ludwig said, you have to acknowledge we are a business. For the first year, we can make it free, but then you are caught. And we looked at actually the things. I mean, Google has fantastic people. I mean, there is a brain in Google and Amazon which we at our universities and Max-Born-Institutes cannot really compete with. The hardware they are doing, they're also doing good hardware developments, but at the end, if we calculated, in fact, what would it cost in going to Google or doing it ourselves, at the end, we would be actually a little bit cheaper. Now, there is a little bit of a difference, in fact, which we cannot do in Germany, unfortunately. I mean, Google is running their computers and things in Finland, where it's cold, and they heat a village with the heat, right? We have to actually pay for taking the heat away. And so that's why we are actually still more expensive, because we cannot German laws would not accept that we put our computers in the cold regions of this planet. So there are possibilities, I think, which we have to accept, but at the end, if Google would be cheaper and it would be guaranteed to be cheaper, it would be fine. But in our case, that was not really true. The people in Berkeley, Materials Project, was actually trying to work with Google. In fact, they prefer to do both, to work with us and with Google. And at the end, I think you don't want to have really that you are depending on the others. Right? And there you have to be very careful. Otherwise, with the machine learning guys and so on, I mean, having really a joint project makes a lot of sense. But something which is short run, not really on a long run. Yeah,
and it's something which should be also maybe changed in future is these NDAs you have to sign if you work with industry. Every company has a different NDA. Even the same institutions sign different NDAs in different research projects. So if there would be a bit more harmonization in that, and more, let's say, established rules on how industry could work with research and the other way around, then it might be a bit better, because so far what we have, these thousands of NDAs in different research institutions, can't be the solution forever. Yeah,
I totally agree. I mean, during my career, I must have signed hundreds of different types of NDAs.
I just wanted to say some more words about the data from industry. I mean, they have big databases. Honestly, talking with them, I accept their worries that they will not share. I mean, if the Germans would share their data and the Americans would not, in a few years there would be no German industry anymore. Right? So I think you cannot really do this. I mean, they are really working in a very competitive business, and you have to accept that. If they are good, actually also Germany is doing pretty well, we hope. So I think forcing people to share data is in general the wrong way. Even in science, I would say you should not force people. You should convince people that this is useful.
Okay, so what you just said brings me to a final point I wanted to discuss, namely the international aspect. I mean, we are talking about the national initiative for data infrastructure, and I was always a bit surprised about that, to be honest, because I mean, in my background in science, which is physics, everything is international. I mean, we publish in American journals predominantly. We work for such journals, even both as reviewers and editors and so on. And so I was a bit surprised to see this initial national approach. On the other hand, it's clear that you have to start somehow. But what I would be interested to hear is what is going on with respect to producing standards on the international level, because only then the thing will fly at the end. And is there in the NFDI, for example, is this part of the activity?
I mean, actually, when we started having the first interviews with our proposal, I said that, and the following, I said actually NFDI, or actually I said we are working international. The national is only the money. So, and that is actually how we're doing research. I mean, the research is done with German money, but it has to be an international concept. Now, 2 years ago, that was not liked by everyone when I said it, so I didn't repeat it. But this is the way we are really operating. We also have a memorandum of understanding with people and with the National Science in Washington and people in Japan. I think it would not make sense to reinvent the wheel with what they have done already. Metadata and data science should be an international activity as science is. But that the national funding agency are paying for that, that's fine.
Good.
Yeah, I'd like to give an example along the same lines. When the Text Plus consortium was started, we have several, in a way, building blocks, and two of them were one were also the Akademie, I have to say here, but two of them were the ERICs Daria and Clarin. These are ERICs in the field of the humanities, and they are international per se, because these are in a European Research Infrastructure Consortium. And when we have been, when Text Plus started, we presented our work in a Clarin cafe, and we received lots of interest, and for instance, Italy built something like a national research data infrastructure by European funding, and successfully they asked for a kind of consortium that is very similar to the Text Plus consortium. So we, in a way, also export the NFDI model to some countries, and it's a nice development, because essentially research data hosting, the funding of the research data has to be an international or even a more local activity, and this is a model that works. I hope will work.
Yeah, I only can underline that, right? So we are all working on an international level, right? And we are not competing with, we are competing worldwide. And this is why this research data management must be worldwide organized as well. And it's like Matthias said, that this natural word there is only in there because the money is coming from the federal and the state level, and that is really the only reason. But one of the main reasons why this NFDI was set up, right, was to keep up with all the international endeavors, and in particular with what's going on the European level. For example, the European Open Science Cloud, right? And that was one of the main, or one important arguments if we discuss with politicians about the funding for NFDI, and we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, I like to share the optimism, but it depends maybe a bit on the consortia and on the data you share. And unfortunately, it's still the case that you can't share personal data with the rest of the world. Yeah, you have limitations. In Europe, it's fine, but otherwise, with third countries, it's not. And I have to say, in some consortia, we have these problems, and we try to build these, let's say, open infrastructures. But internationally, there are other limitations compared to Europe. And yeah, maybe I leave it here, but these are questions we have to solve. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have touched on quite a number of aspects. Are there questions from the audience still? Or comments, or...
I would just, if I may, come back to the credit for the individual researchers, or how we change that culture, where you, I think, correctly point out it's really up to us to change the culture. But I just want to share that now I'm in psychology and a little bit more psycholinguistics area, so social sciences, and over the last 3-4 years, and I've been regular in panels and evaluating committees, search committees for professor positions, and there was not one anymore where open science activity of the candidate was not evaluated. So I think, you know, that part that you sort of said, I mean, so people get credit for it. I think that's, at least in the field that I see, I would say these kinds of activities don't go unnoticed anymore. And even in the really critical points, like whether you are considered for an ERC consolidated grant, or whether you get a call, an offer of a professor position. I must say that I also really systematically always encouraged people in my groups to really include their activities, their reputation on things like cross-validated or Stack Overflow or GitHub. You know, if they have credit points there, make that part of your CV. And I think that is still not done enough. That could be easily done, and that at the same time, I think, is another point that was touched upon in how to assign credit. I think these kinds of open source type activities, they already have really pretty good mechanisms in place, you know, to trace who did what. Like GitHub is almost like perfectly transparent. You can go back in history in a project and find out, well, who wrote that line of code that does that wonderful transformation that we needed for come from Tycho to Kepler, for example. So that was more like a comment, but I think that it's important that there is a little bit, I think, reason for optimism that the field is changing along those lines to make that more transparent.
So I'd like to make one comment or remark to the issue of licenses in the context of data and open data. I think we need these licenses at least to protect them from further privatization again. You know, if I don't put a license or some legalize a thing on our data, we run the risk of being robbed of this data in another way. So somebody claims this data and provides it as something which is only possible then to access via certain other means. As an example, I want to remind of the fate of Mendeleev. This platform where data was collected and then sold to Elsevier. So I think there is something to consider. I'm not sure that putting licenses is the only way to protect that, but we need to think of this opportunity because we are sharing the data, which is right and proper, but there is always the risk of privatization. We have the commons, and the commons was privatized in many ways, and thus robbed from being used by all.
Maybe you have a legal point. I have a more ethical point. This is a very fair point, and I think this danger exists definitely. Well, it has been proven that this exists. I hope that the open research development protects us if we can prove that our data have been was published openly years before or even months before. Then it is very hard to claim the data for somebody else. But I see the points, but this is, yeah, maybe Franziska can continue.
It's similar. I mean, I also see the point that in some cases it might help, but licenses always lead to more property. Yeah, and I'm not sure whether this really helps. If maybe it would help, but maybe not, because if the data are once open, they are reproducible by everyone. Yeah, you can reproduce the data. So if privatization of data is not that easy if they are openly available. Yeah, so I would really contradict, because I would say that it helps in some minor cases, but in most of the cases I would disagree.
So let me just follow up, because I think that's important. We know that GitHub was sold to Microsoft, but what you're saying is I don't have to worry about that.
No. I would say that we don't have to worry about it, but I wouldn't say that. I would say that the data which are already there, you can prove, as you already told us a minute before, to whom it belongs, who invented the data. Yeah, and intellectual property protection means the protection of the intellectual property, but data is often not property. Yeah, and that's, I don't know whether more propertization helps. Yeah.
There's another aspect I want to mention in this context, and that is that if we want to use data with machinery, then how can you be sure, if the data has no binding license, that you can use it? So we are mixing data from different sources and so on. If there is no machine-readable data or valid data license to use it, you can't be assured to use it. So these are points which need to be considered. I'm not saying that a license is the only way to do it, but this is a very important aspect. I can give a lot of examples for that, but we are facing this situation that it's not quite clear whether data is, for instance, owned by somebody or not, that you pointed out. If you, for instance, have a database, then the situation gets murky and so on. So I think we need to be careful to put our data out there, but with enough of assurances that everybody can use them without having later on deal with claims of not legally using it.
Yeah, but the idea is that usually data are open and everyone can use it. What you're saying is that you want to put licenses on data to be assured that no one is using your data or that you don't violate any rights. But the idea of open data is that that they are open for everyone, that everyone can use it. If you put licenses on it, you restrict the openness. This contradicts the whole idea of open data.
Well,
for me.
I'm a little bit of a radical in that sense that I say the only real sensible license you can put on open data is the common is open and CC BY, CC0 in a sense. That's the only way to assure that you can't, for instance, run in a situation where somebody is, for instance, saying, oh, you used one data set from me, you didn't cite it. I think we need to distinguish between licenses for making data open and acknowledgements. That are two things, not one. And I think this is misinterpreted in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so I just wanted to support, I mean, I think as we have it in NOMAD, data are under CC BY, and I think then it's really clear how people can use these data. I also really would like to warn that because maybe a single few people are misusing data, that you then actually put a license which hurts everyone. Right? I mean, to some extent, we had this in the Max-Born-Institut some years ago, that there were 2 books missing in the library, and there was the question, should we have a lock at the library door? And I think this is the best which can happen to a book, as somebody steals a book and reads it. And you should not really, I mean, you should not have a barrier because that happens. And you should not have a license which makes things more complicated.
Okay. Good. That was a nice word at the end, actually. Okay, so I don't see any remarks anymore. So let me thank at the end of this long afternoon all our speakers and panelists and also the audience for your very active participation. Thank you.